Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into a topic that might just make you appreciate your heated blankets and central air a whole lot more. Imagine, if you will, that chill creeping into your bones, not from a slight draft, but from every single direction. You're not in your cozy bed, snuggled under a down comforter. You're lying on a thin layer of straw, the wind whistling through gaps in the walls of your tiny, mud and stick house. Your breath fogs in the air, even indoors. And the biting cold outside is a constant, physical presence, threatening to seep into every fibre of your being. It's a stark reality, a brutal daily grind that would make a polar bear shiver. You probably wouldn't survive this, not without some serious adjustments, that's for sure. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. It's always cool to see how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're going way back, way back, to a time when thermostats were pure fantasy and layers meant putting on another rough-spun tunic. Our focus, the medieval peasant, someone who, by modern standards, lived a life of unimaginable hardship, especially when the temperatures plummeted. You're not a knight in shining armor, nor a lord feasting in a grand hall. You are, unequivocally, part of the vast majority, tied to the land, beholden to its whims, and utterly at the mercy of the seasons. And let me tell you, winter was not just a season, it was an adversary. You wake before dawn, the air sharp and cold enough to steal your breath. Even inside your modest wattle and daub home, this isn't just chilly. This is a deep, penetrating cold that seems to live in the very stones, if you were lucky enough to have any, and timbers of your dwelling. Your first thought, every morning, is likely the same. Warmth. Where does it come from? How do you get it? How do you keep it? These aren't abstract philosophical questions. They are immediate, pressing matters of survival. You see the frost clinging to the inside of the roof, the thin sheet of ice on the water pail you left out overnight. Forget your morning coffee, your hands are already stiff, your joints protesting. The harsh reality of medieval life, particularly for the common folk, was one of constant struggle against the elements. A mainstream historical fact often overlooked is simply how vulnerable the population was to climatic shifts. Famines, often triggered or exacerbated by harsh winters, were not uncommon, leading to widespread suffering and death. Imagine trying to grow enough food when the ground is frozen solid for months on end, or when an unseasonable late frost wipes out your spring crops. It wasn't just about discomfort, it was about the very real threat of starvation and freezing to death. Speaking of threats, here's a quirky tidbit. Some historians suggest that medieval peasants might have sometimes shared their homes with their more valuable livestock. Think a cow or a pig penned off in a corner. While this might sound incredibly strange and, frankly, smelly to us, it provided a valuable source of body heat, a living, breathing, albeit somewhat pungent, radiator. Of course, that also meant dealing with the smells and the mess, but when survival is on the line, a little eau de pigsty is a small price to pay for not succumbing to hypothermia. You can practically feel the steam rising from the animals, mingling with the smoke from the hearth, creating a dense, humid, and probably rather rank atmosphere. And this brings us to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the practice of bringing livestock indoors was common necessity or rare desperation. Was it a regular occurrence, an accepted part of winter living for everyone who could manage it, or was it only done by the most impoverished or in the most extreme conditions? The evidence is often anecdotal or inferred from archaeological remains, making it difficult to paint a definitive picture. You can imagine the discussions among scholars, poring over fragmented texts and the remains of old hearths, trying to piece together the daily lives of people so far removed from our own experiences. One thing's for sure, surviving winter was a full-time job, and every trick, no matter how unappealing, was on the table. You're constantly weighing the discomfort against the very real danger of not making it to spring. So, you're huddled in your home, which, let's be honest, is less of a sturdy structure and more a collection of cleverly arranged natural materials. Your medieval abode, if you can even call it that, is typically a wattle and daub construction. Imagine a skeletal frame made of woven branches and stakes. That's the wattle. Then you slather it with a delightful concoction of mud, clay, sand, straw, and sometimes even animal dung. That's the daub. Sounds charming, right? You're essentially living inside a giant, very primitive bird's nest, while surprisingly strong for its components, especially when regularly maintained. Its insulating properties left much to be desired. You can practically feel the chilly breath of winter seeping through every tiny crack and crevice. It's a bit like living in a colander, but for heat. These walls, perhaps a foot thick, were your primary defense against the biting winds and driving snow, but they weren't exactly airtight. You'd find drafts snaking in through gaps where the daub had cracked or fallen away, or simply through the inherent porosity of the material. There were no double-glazed windows here, no sophisticated weather stripping. Windows, if you had them at all, were often just unglazed openings, sometimes covered with shutters that you'd pull closed at night. Or perhaps a piece of animal bladder or oiled cloth to let in a bit of diffused light while keeping out the worst of the elements. You're not looking out at a snowy wonderland, you're just grateful for whatever feeble barrier stands between you and frostbite. A mainstream historical fact about these dwellings is that they were typically single-room structures, often shared by an entire family, sometimes with multiple generations under one leaky roof. There was no concept of private bedrooms or dedicated living areas. Everyone slept, ate, and lived in the same cramped space. This isn't just a matter of social structure, it's a practical survival strategy. All those bodies, all that collective warmth, made a noticeable, if still inadequate, difference in a world without central heating. You're rubbing elbows, literally, with your siblings, your parents, maybe even your grandparents, all trying to share that precious, fleeting warmth. Now, for a quirky tidbit, to further combat the cold and drafts, peasants would often use thatch not just for the roof, but sometimes for the walls as well, or as an additional layer over the wattle and daub. Imagine bundles of dried reeds or straw, meticulously layered and tied down. This provided an extra barrier, a thick blanket of plant matter that trapped air and added a surprising amount of insulation. It's the medieval equivalent of extra attic insulation. But on your walls, the downside, it was a prime spot for vermin to set up residence, and it was highly flammable. You're trading one discomfort for another, but at least the rats are warm too, I suppose. Just try not to think about them scurrying around inside your walls while you're trying to sleep. And here's an open scholarly debate on this very topic. Historians still argue whether the perceived squatness and low ceilings of many excavated medieval peasant homes were primarily for structural stability or for heat retention. Were they built low to the ground and with compressed ceilings because that was the easiest way to make them sturdy with available materials? Or was there a conscious, albeit unwritten, understanding that a smaller volume of air was easier to heat and keep warm? You could imagine a weary peasant, back aching from a day in the fields, thinking, "At least this tiny hut won't take much to warm up, if we can ever get a fire going, that is." The truth is likely a blend of both, but it highlights the constant interplay between practical needs and environmental constraints that shaped their daily lives. You're not thinking about aesthetics or curb appeal, you're thinking about whether you'll wake up with icicles on your eyelashes, with the hearth burning bravely, albeit smokily. You find yourself instinctively drawn towards its meagre warmth. But the heat doesn't just come from the fire, it comes from shared warmth. You're not just sharing a house, you're sharing body heat. Imagine everyone in your family, your spouse, your children, maybe an elderly parent or two, all crammed into that single room. You're bundled in whatever rough clothing you possess, huddled together on straw pallets, each body contributing its own small furnace to the collective effort against the cold. It's less about personal space and more about communal survival, a medieval slumber party. But less about fun and more about not freezing to death. This wasn't just a matter of cuddling for comfort. It was a fundamental survival strategy. Every human body radiates heat, and when multiple bodies are in close proximity, that heat pools, creating a microclimate that's noticeably warmer than the frigid air just a few feet away. You might have even slept head to toe, or spooned tightly, not for affection, but for sheer thermodynamic efficiency. It's the ultimate communal heating system, fueled by metabolism and sheer desperation. A mainstream historical fact is that this practice of co-sleeping, often with multiple family members in one bed or on shared sleeping platforms, was the norm across various social strata in medieval Europe, not just among peasants. Privacy, as we understand it today, was a luxury almost unheard of, even in wealthier households. Servants often slept in the same rooms as their masters, or in large dormitories. For peasants, this was intensified by the small size of their dwellings and the absolute necessity of retaining every possible bit of warmth. You can almost feel the collective sigh of relief as everyone settles down, generating just enough warmth to make the night bearable. And here's a quirky tidbit, as we touched on before. Sometimes this shared warmth extended to the family's most valuable livestock. Imagine your goat, perhaps, or a very small, relatively clean pig, tethered in a corner of the hut, while certainly not hygienic by modern standards, and definitely contributing to the general aroma of the dwelling. The animal's body heat was a non-trivial addition to the overall thermal strategy. It's like having a furry, four-legged hot water bottle that occasionally oinks or bleats. You might wake up to the sound of chewing or a mild barnyard scent, but at least your toes aren't numb. This practice underscores the symbiotic relationship between medieval humans and their animals, where every living thing had a role in the household's survival. This naturally leads us to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the presence of livestock indoors was a common, deliberate strategy for warmth, or an emergency measure only taken during the most severe cold snaps. Was it a regular, accepted part of winter living, integrated into the design and function of peasant homes, or was it a desperate last resort? The practical challenges of sharing living space with large animals, their waste, their noise, their potential for damage, suggest it might not have been an everyday choice. But the undeniable benefit of their warmth argues otherwise. You picture a tired peasant weighing the smell against the shivers, and the shivers probably win out every time. You might even find yourself unconsciously pressing closer to the warmest body nearby, whether it's your child or the aforementioned goat, just trying to eke out a few more degrees of comfort beyond the meager warmth of the hearth and the shared body heat of your family and potentially livestock. Your next line of defense against the medieval cold was your crude clothing. Forget goose down, fleece, or waterproof synthetics. You're adorned in the simplest, most fundamental fabrics available, wool and linen. These weren't the soft, fine weaves you might imagine. Think scratchy, coarse, and probably a bit smelly after a long winter of wear. You pull on your layers, feeling the rough texture against your skin, knowing it's all you have between you and the biting wind. Wool was, unequivocally, king for warmth. Its natural crimp traps air, providing insulation, and it retains some of its insulating properties even when damp, which was a huge advantage in a world where staying dry was a constant battle. You'd likely wear a simple wool tunic, perhaps a thicker one for winter, maybe even two if you were fortunate. Over that, you might have a heavier cloak or mantle, again, often made of rough wool. The colours were almost certainly muted, undyed browns, greys, or natural creams, reflecting the raw materials and the limited dyeing techniques available to peasants. You're not making a fashion statement, you're just trying to survive. Linen, derived from flax, was typically used for undergarments, shirts, or anything closer to the skin, as it's smoother and more breathable than wool. While not inherently warm, it provided a necessary layer against the scratchiness of the wool and could be washed more easily, though washing itself was a cold and arduous task in winter. You'd wear a linen undershirt, then your wool tunic, then perhaps another tunic or cloak. It was all about layering, an intuitive response to the cold. You add one garment on top of another, creating dead air spaces that trap heat. Much like how modern insulation works, it's effective, but also bulky and restrictive, turning you into a somewhat shapeless, bundled figure. A mainstream historical fact is that clothing often reflected social status, even down to the colours. Sumptuary laws in various regions dictated what certain classes could wear, preventing peasants from wearing fine silks or vibrant dyes. Your practical, undyed wool and linen garments were not just a matter of availability. They were a visible sign of your place in the rigid medieval hierarchy. You weren't allowed to pretend to be a lord just by donning a fancy cloak, even if you somehow acquired one. Here's a quirky tidbit to add an extra layer of warmth and, surprisingly, a bit of rigidity. Some garments, especially cloaks, might have been fulled. This is a process where wool fabric is deliberately shrunk and thickened by beating and wetting it, creating a denser, more water-resistant material. Imagine taking a wool blanket and essentially felting it until it's almost board-like. This made the fabric incredibly warm and durable, but also stiff and heavy. You'd probably move like a slightly grumpy, wool-clad robot. But at least you wouldn't be quite as cold. It's a crude but effective way of turning a relatively thin fabric into a robust barrier against the elements. This leads us to an open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants truly understood the thermal principles behind layering or simply arrived at the practice through trial and error born of necessity. Did they consciously think, an air pocket will insulate? Or did they just find that more clothes equals warmer, leading them to pile on whatever they had? You can picture generations of peasants experimenting, figuring out what worked through bitter experience. Was it primitive science, or just instinctual survival? Either way, you're constantly adjusting your crude layers, trying to find that perfect balance between movement and retaining every precious bit of warmth. While your body was bundled in wool and linen, your feet were often the forgotten, freezing frontiers of your existence. Let's talk about footwear fails in medieval times. You're not lacing up insulated boots with rubber soles and arch support. You're likely stuffing your feet into something far less forgiving. The primary materials, leather and wood, and neither offered much in the way of warmth or waterproofing. You pull on your rudimentary shoes, feeling the cold leather stiffen around your toes, knowing that moisture is just a puddle away. For most peasants, footwear consisted of simple leather shoes, often made from undyed, untreated hides. These weren't designed for comfort or long-term durability in wet, cold conditions. Imagine a basic leather pouch for your foot, perhaps tied with a thong. They offered some protection from sharp stones and thorns, but virtually none from the cold, damp ground. When the snow fell or the mud froze, these shoes were essentially useless for insulation. Your feet would quickly become soaked and numb, making every step a painful reminder of the biting chill. It's like wearing glorified socks made of rawhide, sometimes, for added height and a slight reprieve from the mud. You might encounter wooden pattens or clogs. These were essentially wooden platforms that your leather shoes, or bare feet, would sit on, lifting you an inch or two above the muck. While they provided some separation from the coldest, wettest ground, they offered zero flexibility and were incredibly cumbersome. Imagine trying to trudge through a frozen field in what amounts to wooden blocks strapped to your feet. It's less a walk and more a stilted, awkward shuffle. You'd clatter along, each step a potential slip on ice or hidden uneven ground, your toes still feeling the chill radiating up through the wood. A mainstream historical fact is that the vast majority of medieval peasants, especially during cold weather, suffered from chronic foot problems due to inadequate footwear. Frostbite, chilblains, and trench-foot-like conditions were common ailments, leading to infections, permanent damage, and even amputation in severe cases. Your feet were your livelihood, yet they were constantly exposed to brutal conditions with little protection, making every winter day a risk. Here's a quirky tidbit. To combat the constant damp and cold, people would sometimes stuff their shoes with straw, hay, or even dried moss. This provided a very basic, albeit temporary, form of insulation. A crude medieval sock liner. You'd pull out the damp, compacted stuffing at the end of the day, hoping it would dry by morning, only to repeat the process. It's a bit like trying to keep warm with a damp tea towel, but every little bit helped when hypothermia was knocking at your door. The downside, of course, was that this organic material would quickly become wet, rot, and host all sorts of unpleasant things, adding to the general odour and discomfort. This leads us to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of foot-related ailments among medieval peasants was primarily due to the lack of technology for better footwear, or a lack of understanding regarding basic foot hygiene and care. Was it simply that they couldn't make better shoes, Or did they not grasp the long-term health consequences of constant cold and damp? You can almost hear a scholar today lamenting the lost opportunities for better health if only they'd had some proper woolen socks and waterproof boots. Regardless, you're constantly aware of your feet, numb and aching, as you try to complete your daily chores, praying for the thaw. When the biting cold seeped through your wattle and daub walls and your crude wool clothing, one surprising ally in your fight for warmth was the humble bed of straw and hay. This wasn't just animal fodder, it was the original memory foam, the medieval equivalent of an insulating mattress, and a multi-purpose tool for survival. You sink onto your straw pallet at night, feeling the rustle beneath you, a familiar sensation that signals a small reprieve from the cold. Hard ground. Imagine a large sack or a designated area on the floor, loosely filled with dried straw or hay. This formed your bed. While certainly not luxurious, these natural materials offered several crucial advantages. Firstly, they provided insulation from the cold earth or floor. Air trapped within the numerous hollow stems of the straw created a barrier, preventing your precious body heat from seeping directly into the ground. It's the same principle as the air pockets in your wool tunic, just on a larger, more prone to poking scale. Secondly, the straw offered a surprising amount of cushioning, making your sleep marginally more comfortable than simply lying on packed earth. Beyond just bedding, straw and hay were versatile resources. They could be packed into wall cavities for additional insulation, used as a sort of primitive draft stopper stuffed into cracks, or even woven into crude mats that could be placed on floors. When old bedding became too compacted or infested, it could be cleared out and replaced, with the old straw often used as animal bedding or even mixed into the daub for wall repairs. It was a constant cycle of use and repurpose, reflecting the scarcity of resources. You're constantly surrounded by it. Its dry, earthy smell a constant companion. A mainstream historical fact is that straw mattresses, or palliases, remained common sleeping arrangements for the poorer classes well into the early modern period, and even beyond in some rural areas. The concept of a sprung mattress was centuries away, making straw the most accessible and affordable option for a softer, warmer sleep surface for the vast majority of the population, even in grander homes. Straw often formed the base for more elaborate feather beds. Here's a quirky tidbit about this ubiquitous material. Some sources suggest that certain herbs, like lavender or wormwood, might have been mixed into the sleeping straw. This wasn't just for a pleasant aroma, but potentially for their purported medicinal properties, or to act as a natural deterrent against fleas, lice, and other unwanted pests. So, you're not just sleeping on straw, you might be sleeping on a slightly scented, anti-bug medieval aromatherapy bed. Of course, the effectiveness varied, and you probably still woke up with an itch or two, but it was a nice thought. This brings us to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the frequent replacement of straw bedding was primarily for hygiene, comfort, or simply because it degraded too quickly to last much longer. Was it a conscious effort to keep pests at bay and prevent illness? Or did the straw simply become too flat, damp, and unsupportive over time, necessitating regular renewal? You can imagine the arduous task of regularly emptying, cleaning, and refilling these large straw sacks, especially in the depths of winter. It's a chore, certainly, but one that directly impacted your ability to get a semi-decent night's sleep and maintain even a basic level of warmth. You pull the straw closer, feeling its dry warmth, grateful for this simple barrier against the relentless chill. As the cold seeped into every crack of your dwelling and gnawed at your bones, the most immediate and satisfying warmth, after the fire itself, came from within, fireside feasts of hot porridge and hearty stews. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was an internal furnace, a vital tool in keeping hypothermia at bay. You gather around the hearth, the smells of simmering grains and root vegetables filling the smoky air, your stomach rumbling in anticipation. Your diet, as a medieval peasant, was dictated by the seasons and what could be grown or gathered. In winter, fresh produce was scarce to non-existent, Instead, you relied heavily on stored grains and dried provisions. Porridge was a staple, often made from oats, barley, or rye. Imagine a thick, gruel-like consistency, perhaps flavored with a few wild herbs if you were lucky, or just plain. It wasn't gourmet, but it was hot, filling, and delivered slow-release energy that helped keep your internal temperature up. You grip your wooden spoon, blowing gently on the steaming spoonful before slurping it down, feeling its warmth spread through your chest. Stews were another winter savior. These would be thick, communal affairs, simmering for hours over the fire. They'd contain whatever vegetables had been successfully stored from the harvest: cabbages, onions, parsnips, turnips, perhaps some dried peas or beans. Meat was a rare luxury for most peasants, probably only seen after a communal hunt or if an animal had to be slaughtered early. But even without meat, a hot, hearty vegetable stew, seasoned with salt and whatever wild herbs you knew, was a deeply comforting and warming meal. You dip a piece of stale bread into the thick broth, savoring every drop of its warmth and flavor. A mainstream historical fact is that the vast majority of the medieval peasant diet was cereal-based, often consisting of over 70 to 80% grains. This high-carbohydrate diet provided the necessary calories for arduous physical labor and, critically, for generating body heat in cold environments. Without this constant intake of energy, simply existing in the cold would have been unsustainable. Here's a quirky tidbit: to ensure a continuous supply of winter food, peasants often practiced a form of food caching or burying. Root vegetables, apples, and even certain meats might be buried in pits or cellars, insulated with straw and earth. This primitive refrigeration allowed them to preserve food long after the harvest. Imagine carefully digging up a frozen turnip from a buried cache, a small victory against the harsh winter. It's a testament to their ingenuity and understanding of natural preservation methods, even without modern science. This leads us to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants genuinely suffered from widespread vitamin deficiencies due to their limited winter diet, or if their diet, while monotonous, provided adequate nutrition for survival. While the lack of fresh fruit and vegetables for months on end seems problematic by modern standards, did the consumption of fermented foods, certain wild plants, and small amounts of animal products, like eggs from their chickens, somehow compensate? You might feel sluggish, certainly, but you're probably not thinking about your vitamin C intake. Just the sheer volume of calories needed to keep going, the smell of the simmering pot, the warmth of the steam, and the feeling of a full belly are immediate comforts in a world defined by scarcity. As the cold gnawed at your bones and the hot porridge settled in your stomach, another source of internal warmth, and a vital part of medieval life, came in liquid form: fermented drinks. Forget your pristine bottled water, your thirst was quenched, and your spirits often lifted by ale, mead, and cider. These weren't just beverages, they were safer than often contaminated water sources, provided calories, and, of course, offered a warming buzz that helped take the edge off the constant chill. You raise your rough wooden cup, the slightly cloudy liquid steaming faintly in the cold air, and take a grateful gulp. Ale, typically brewed from barley, was the most common and accessible drink for peasants. It was often weak by modern standards, brewed daily or weekly, and consumed by adults and children alike, though children would receive a much weaker version. The fermentation process made it safer to drink than untreated water, as the alcohol and boiling killed off many harmful bacteria. It provided vital hydration and a surprising number of calories. A small but significant energy boost in a diet that was often just enough to get by. You feel a mild warmth spread through your chest after a few sips, a welcome sensation in the frigid air. Mead, a fermented honey drink, was less common for the poorest peasants due to the expense of honey, but might be made for special occasions or by those who kept bees. Cider, fermented apple juice, was popular in apple-growing regions. These drinks were not just about getting tipsy, they were a consistent, reliable source of liquid nourishment. Imagine drinking weak ale with every meal, from dawn till dusk. It was simply part of the daily rhythm, a necessary component of your energy intake and a small comfort against the harsh realities of your existence. A mainstream historical fact often overlooked is that the medieval reliance on ale and other fermented beverages significantly reduced the incidence of waterborne diseases that plagued communities relying on polluted water sources. While they didn't understand germ theory, they intuitively knew that boiled water used in brewing was safer. This casual observation, passed down through generations, saved countless lives. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some medieval brewing practices involved throwing a hot stone directly into the ale to rapidly heat it, a technique known as stone brewing. This wasn't just for warmth, it could also caramelize some of the sugars, adding a unique flavor profile to the brew. Imagine the hiss and steam as a glowing red stone plunges into your wooden barrel of ale, creating a dramatic, if slightly dangerous, spectacle. It's a primitive form of fast-track fermentation and a way to quickly warm a large quantity of liquid for communal consumption. This leads us to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the constant consumption of weak ale contributed to chronic low-level intoxication among medieval peasants, or if their bodies developed a high tolerance that negated significant impairment. While the alcohol content was low, was it enough to dull their senses and affect their daily work over time? Or did their demanding physical labor and constant outdoor exposure simply burn it off? You might feel a pleasant fuzziness around the edges of your perception after a few tankards, but you still have to trudge out to the frozen fields. So perhaps any impairment was minimal or quickly adapted to. The soothing warmth, however, was undeniable, even with the internal warmth from your ale and porridge and the smoky embrace of the hearth. Winter didn't mean a break from labor, far from it. You still faced the grim reality of winter work, enduring the elements outdoors, battling the cold not just for comfort, but for sheer survival and to prepare for the crucial spring planting. You pull your cloak tighter, feeling the biting wind whip around you as you step out of your dwelling, the crisp, freezing air instantly stealing any warmth you'd accumulated indoors. While the intense agricultural demands of planting and harvesting might have paused, other essential tasks continued. Forestry was paramount. You'd spend arduous hours in the frigid woods, felling trees, chopping logs, and gathering fallen branches. This wasn't just for your own hearth. Wood was a vital commodity, often part of the rent you owed your lord, or a means to barter for other necessities. Imagine the sheer physical effort of swinging an axe in sub-zero temperatures, your muscles aching, your breath clouding in front of you, your hands numb despite your efforts to keep them gloved. Every swing of the axe, every lift of a heavy log, was a battle against the cold that sought to stiffen your limbs. Beyond felling trees, there was maintenance, fences needed mending, tools needed repairing, and sometimes, if the ground wasn't completely rock hard, basic ground preparation or ditch digging might occur. Animals still needed tending, feeding, watering, often by breaking ice on frozen ponds or streams, and protecting from predators. You'd be hauling water from a frozen well, your fingers burning with cold, the bucket heavy and ungainly. It's a relentless cycle, a grim dance with the elements, where every task feels exponentially harder when your fingers are numb and your toes ache. A mainstream historical fact is that the medieval concept of winter dormancy for peasants was largely a myth born of modern romanticism. While the rhythm of work shifted, there was no long holiday season. Winter was a period of essential maintenance, resource gathering, and preparation, crucial for ensuring the spring planting could commence without delay and for preventing starvation over the leanest months. The work was perhaps less intense in some ways than harvest, but it was physically brutal due to the environmental conditions. Here's a quirky tidbit about winter work. In areas with suitable ice and snow, peasants sometimes utilized simple sleds or toboggans, often made from crude planks, to haul heavy loads like firewood or building materials. This was far more efficient than carrying them on one's back through deep snow. Imagine the squeak of runners on hard-packed snow, the satisfying ease of pulling a heavy load that would be impossible on bare ground. It's a small concession to efficiency in an otherwise incredibly laborious existence. A brief moment where nature actually lends a hand. This leads us to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the increased risk of accidents and injuries during winter work was primarily due to the adverse weather conditions, or the sheer exhaustion and lowered physical state of peasants due to the cold and limited diet? Were you more likely to cut yourself with an axe because your hands were numb from the cold, or because you were simply running on fumes after months of meager rations and constant shivering? You're certainly less agile, your movements slower and more deliberate, as you try to avoid slipping on ice or dropping a heavy log on your already aching foot. Every task carries an added layer of peril when winter is your ever-present companion, with winter work a constant reality, the very backbone of your ability to survive the cold. Beyond your immediate dwelling came from the forest resources. The woods surrounding your village weren't just a place of mystery or danger, they were a living pantry and hardware store, providing essential fuel for your hearth and materials for virtually every aspect of your life. You trudge into the snow-dusted woods, the crisp air biting at your cheeks, your breath pluming like smoke, searching for the fallen branches and standing deadwood that mean the difference between warmth and freezing. Your primary quest, day in and day out, was fuelwood. Every ember in your hearth, every hot meal, every bit of internal warmth relied on a steady supply of wood. This wasn't as simple as going to a lumber yard. You were often limited to collecting fallen branches, dead wood, or small trees, as larger, healthier timber was usually reserved for the lord or for construction. Imagine the back-breaking labor of breaking off frozen branches, hauling them back to your hut, and then chopping them into manageable pieces with a dull axe. It's a never-ending cycle. The moment your woodpile dwindles, panic sets in. You're constantly aware of the preciousness of each log, each splinter, knowing it represents another hour of warmth, beyond just fuel. The forest provided other vital resources. You might forage for certain wild berries that could be preserved, or for hardy roots that could supplement your meager diet. Reeds and rushes from marshy areas could be used for thatching or for stuffing into mattresses, bark could be used for tanning hides, and saplings for weaving baskets or mending fences. The forest was an ecosystem of survival, demanding respect and intimate knowledge of its offerings. You learn to read the signs, to know which trees burn best, which paths are safest, and where the best foraging spots might be. A mainstream historical fact is that common rights to access forested land for fuel and foraging were fiercely protected by peasants in many medieval societies, despite the land technically belonging to the lord. These rights were often enshrined in local custom and were absolutely vital for the survival of the rural population, highlighting the critical role of forests in their subsistence economy. Without these customary rights, winter would have been even more devastating. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some medieval peasants, particularly in more heavily forested areas, might have practiced a rudimentary form of coppicing or pollarding. This involves cutting trees back to a stump or a specific height to encourage new, straight growth, creating a sustainable source of smaller timber and branches for fuel or craft over many years. It's a surprisingly sophisticated form of forest management, allowing them to harvest wood without destroying the forest. You're not just taking, you're cultivating. Ensuring future generations also have access to this life-sustaining resource. This leads us to an open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the perceived over-exploitation of medieval forests by peasant communities was a result of sheer necessity, or if it indicates a lack of foresight regarding long-term environmental sustainability. Were they simply desperate to survive each winter, leading to practices that depleted forest resources, or did their traditional methods of resource management, like coppicing, actually ensure a level of sustainability that we often underestimate? You can see the dilemma. Cut enough to stay warm this year, but leave enough for the years to come. It's a delicate balance, and one that often swayed heavily towards immediate needs when the cold was truly biting. You heft another armload of wood, feeling the weight, understanding its immense value, while your individual efforts to gather firewood and stay warm were paramount. You weren't entirely alone in your struggle against the medieval winter. The very fabric of rural life, the village itself, provided a crucial layer of defense through communal efforts. This wasn't just about neighborly goodwill, it was a deeply ingrained system of mutual aid, born of necessity, where survival often depended on the strength of the collective. You see your neighbors, bundled against the cold, working alongside you, and there's a quiet understanding that binds you all in this shared ordeal. Imagine your village, a cluster of wattle and daub huts, perhaps a small church, and some communal land. When the snow piled high or a sudden cold snap threatened, individual struggles quickly became shared burdens. Farmers might pool their efforts to clear snow from vital pathways, ensuring that access to the well or the Lord's mill remained open. If a family's roof was damaged by a winter storm, neighbours would likely assist in repairs, knowing that their own dwelling might be next. It's a reciprocal system. You help your neighbour today, and they'll help you tomorrow. This cooperation extended to sharing resources when one family's supply ran critically low. Perhaps a family had an unexpected bounty of stored root vegetables, or another had a larger-than-average woodpile. While not a socialist utopia, there was an informal understanding that hoarding beyond a certain point was unsustainable for the community's overall well-being. A severely weakened or sick family meant fewer hands for the crucial spring planting, impacting everyone. This informal social safety net was a crude but effective buffer against the worst ravages of winter. You might lend a few logs from your carefully hoarded pile, knowing that act of kindness might be returned when your own provisions dwindle. A mainstream historical fact is that peasant communities often operated with strong internal social bonds and collective responsibilities, while the feudal system dictated their relationship with the lord. Within the village, mutual aid societies, shared labour, and customary practices of support were common. This self-reliance and collective action were essential survival mechanisms in an era without formalised welfare systems. Here's a quirky tidbit. During particularly brutal cold snaps, some villages might have practiced a form of communal baking or shared warmth. While not every peasant home had its own oven, these were often communal or belonged to the lord. The heat generated from a large, shared bread oven would be immense. Villagers might take turns using it, or simply gather nearby while bread was baking, soaking up the residual warmth. Imagine the delicious smell of fresh bread mingling with the general smoky odour of the village. A small comfort in the biting cold. It's a fleeting moment of warmth and shared sustenance that transcends the individual hearth. This leads us to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the apparent level of communal solidarity in medieval peasant villages was primarily driven by altruism and genuine care, or by a pragmatic understanding that individual survival was inextricably linked to community survival. Was it a deep sense of brotherhood, or simply enlightened self-interest? You can imagine the internal debate of a peasant. Do I share my meagre resources, or do I protect my own? But if my neighbour starves, who will help me when I'm weak? The cold, it seems, fostered a unique kind of interdependence. You feel the presence of others around you, a small comfort in the vast, unforgiving landscape of winter, while the brutal realities of peasant life often left you feeling isolated in your struggle against the cold. Another entity offered a different kind of solace and, at times, tangible aid, the Church's role. Christianity was the bedrock of medieval society, and while its primary focus was spiritual salvation, its earthly presence often manifested in acts of charity, providing shelters, and offering spiritual belief that gave hope in a seemingly hopeless existence. You stumble into the cold, draughty stone church, the air thick with the scent of old incense and damp stone, seeking not just spiritual comfort, but perhaps a fleeting moment of slightly warmer air. The church, through its various monastic orders, cathedrals, and local parish churches, often acted as the primary, and sometimes only, welfare institution of the era. Monasteries, in particular, were known for their hospitality and almsgiving. During severe winters or times of famine, they might open their doors to the poor, offering temporary shelter, warm food, or a small handout of grain. While these acts of charity were rarely sufficient to alleviate widespread suffering, they provided a crucial safety net for the most desperate. You might have heard whispers of a nearby monastery offering a bowl of thin gruel to travellers, a beacon of hope in a bleak landscape, beyond physical aid. The Church offered spiritual comfort in a world where natural disasters and harsh winters felt like divine punishments. The Church provided explanations, rituals, and the promise of a better afterlife. Attending Mass, praying, and participating in religious festivals offered a psychological escape from the relentless grind of winter survival. The shared communal experience of worship, even in a cold church, could foster a sense of solidarity and hope. You bow your head, feeling the cold of the stone floor through your thin shoes, but perhaps finding a fleeting warmth in shared prayer. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval monastic institutions played a significant role in social welfare, often acting as hospitals, hospices, and poorhouses long before state-sponsored systems existed. While their resources were finite, their mandate for charity meant they were often the first and last resort for those facing destitution, especially during periods of extreme hardship like harsh winters. Here's a quirky tidbit. During particularly cold winters, some larger churches and cathedrals, especially those with wealthy patrons, might have organized winter fires or communal warming events where large fires were built in the church courtyard or a dedicated hall, and the poor could gather to share warmth and perhaps a simple meal. Imagine the sight, a roaring bonfire, casting dancing shadows on the ancient stone walls, surrounded by shivering figures grateful for the brief respite from the biting cold. It's a poignant image of human need and institutional response, however limited. This leads us to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the Church's charitable efforts significantly impacted overall peasant survival rates during harsh winters, or if they merely offered symbolic comfort and sporadic relief to a small percentage of the suffering population. Was it a truly impactful intervention, or more of a gesture that barely scratched the surface of widespread misery? You might feel a flicker of gratitude for the warmth of the fire, or the sustenance of a donated meal. But you also know that countless others are still freezing in their huts, waiting for a thaw that seems to take forever to arrive. The Church's role was certainly a complex blend of spiritual succor and practical, albeit often insufficient, assistance. Despite all the strategies for warmth, the hearth, shared bodies, crude clothing, hot food, and even the sporadic charity of the Church, winter often brought its most grim and relentless consequence, disease and death, for the medieval peasant. The coldest months were a period of significantly increased vulnerability, a time when the grim harvest truly took its toll. You see it in the vacant eyes of your neighbours, the hushed conversations, the increasingly frequent sound of the church bell tolling for another lost soul, the constant cold, dampness, and poor sanitation within confined living spaces created a perfect breeding ground for illness. Respiratory infections like pneumonia and bronchitis were rampant, exacerbated by the smoky air inside homes. Without proper ventilation, the air you breathed was often thick with soot and airborne pathogens. Your body, already weakened by a monotonous, often calorie-deficient diet and constant physical labor in harsh conditions, was less able to fight off infection. A simple cold could quickly escalate into something fatal. You cough, a deep, rattling sound in your chest, and wonder if this is the beginning of the end, beyond respiratory ailments. Conditions like dysentery thrived in communities with contaminated water sources. Even ale wasn't a perfect shield, and rudimentary waste disposal. Malnutrition weakened immune systems further, and of course, the constant exposure to the elements, leading to frostbite and hypothermia, could directly cause death or make you susceptible to other diseases. There were no antibiotics, no readily available effective medicines. Medieval medicine relied on herbal remedies, bleeding, and prayer, which were often ineffective against virulent infections. A mainstream historical fact is that winter mortality rates in medieval Europe were consistently higher than in other seasons, particularly for the very young and the very old. Demographic studies of burial records and historical texts reveal clear seasonal peaks in deaths, directly correlating with the coldest months and periods of food scarcity. This wasn't just a tough season, it was a deadly one. Here's a quirky tidbit about medieval winter ailments. Some folk remedies for severe colds and coughs involved inhaling steam from boiling concoctions of herbs, often including strong-smelling ones like garlic or onions, or even animal fats, while perhaps providing some temporary relief for congested airways. The effectiveness against serious infections was minimal at best. Imagine a small pot bubbling over your hearth, filling your smoky hut with the pungent aroma of garlic and desperation. As you hover over it, trying to breathe deeply. It's a testament to their resourcefulness, even if the results were often tragically futile. This leads us to an open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the primary cause of increased winter mortality was direct exposure and hypothermia, the rapid spread of infectious diseases in cramped living conditions, or chronic malnutrition that weakened immune systems. Was it the cold itself that killed most people? Or was the cold merely the catalyst that allowed diseases to flourish and malnourished bodies to succumb? You watch as another family member shivers with fever, knowing that the odds are stacked against them. And the grim statistics of winter are playing out before your very eyes. The constant threat of illness was an ever-present shadow, making every winter day a testament to resilience, or a journey towards an early grave. Among those most vulnerable to winter's brutal embrace were the youngest members of your village, children in winter, their small bodies, still developing, with less fat reserves and often less robust immune systems, faced a magnified struggle for survival. You watch your own child, shivering despite the layers you've wrapped them in, their little nose perpetually runny, and your heart aches with the fear that so many medieval parents knew all too well. For medieval peasant children, winter was not a time for snowball fights and cozy stories by the fire. It was a period of intense vulnerability. They were more susceptible to respiratory illnesses, often made worse by the smoky interiors of their homes, diarrheal diseases, amplified by poor hygiene and contaminated water, could quickly lead to dehydration and death in tiny bodies. Malnutrition, while a constant threat for adults, could be catastrophic for growing children, stunting their development and leaving them profoundly weakened. Imagine trying to keep a squirming, curious toddler warm and clean in a world without diapers, sterile wipes, or even reliably clean water. Their clothing was often hand-me-downs, patched and worn, offering less protection than an adult's more robust garments. Their feet were likely even less protected, making them prone to chilblains and frostbite, while adults could rely on strenuous physical labor to generate some internal heat. Children often lacked this option, their activity curtailed by the cold and the necessity to stay close to the hearth. You try to keep your child near the fire, constantly checking their tiny hands and feet for the telltale signs of numbness and cold. A mainstream historical fact is that infant and child mortality rates in medieval Europe were astronomically high, with a significant portion of children not surviving past the age of 5, while many factors contributed. The harshness of winter, with its increased risk of disease and scarcity of resources, played a major role in these devastating statistics. It was a common, heartbreaking reality for nearly every family. Here's a quirky tidbit. To keep infants warm, medieval parents might swaddle them very tightly in multiple layers of cloth, sometimes even pinning them down to prevent them from kicking off covers or crawling away from the limited warmth of the hearth. This isn't just about security, it's a deliberate effort to create a warm, and contained microclimate for the baby, a human burrito designed for maximum heat retention. You'd wrap your newborn in every scrap of clean cloth you owned, hoping against hope that the warmth would keep them alive through the long, dark night. This leads us to an open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether medieval parents, despite the high mortality rates, truly invested emotionally in their very young children in the same way modern parents do, given the constant threat of early death. Some theories suggest a degree of emotional detachment as a coping mechanism, while others argue that love and grief were just as profound, regardless of the statistical realities. You cradle your shivering child, whispering lullabies in the smoky darkness, and whether it's out of a deep emotional bond or primal instinct, you know you'd do anything to see them through to the spring. Their survival is your most urgent prayer. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, frigid shadows across your village, the anticipation of the night brought its own set of challenges and well-worn practices. This was when the nighttime rituals truly began, a series of routines and preparations to brace yourself and your family for the longest, coldest, and often most dangerous hours. You finish your meager evening meal, the last embers of the day's sunlight fading, and begin the deliberate process of securing what little warmth you possess. First, the hearth. You meticulously bank the fire, carefully covering the embers with ash to keep them smouldering through the night. This wasn't just about saving fuel, it was about ensuring you didn't have to start a new fire from scratch in the morning, an arduous task with cold, stiff fingers and primitive tools like flint and steel. The faint glow beneath the ash offers a lingering psychological comfort, a tiny promise of warmth to come. You carefully add a few larger logs, hoping they'll burn slowly and provide some residual heat for a few hours. Next, securing the dwelling, any shutters on windows, if you had them, would be tightly latched. Doors, usually crude wooden planks, would be bolted or barred. Gaps in the walls might be stuffed with straw or old rags. A desperate attempt to keep out the drafts that seemed to find every weakness. You tuck straw around the base of the door, feeling the cold air pushing against your palm, knowing every tiny effort helps. Finally, preparing for sleep. This meant bundling up in every available layer of clothing, even those that smelled faintly of smoke and unwashed bodies. Straw pallets would be fluffed. And if you had any animal skins or heavy wool blankets, they would be carefully arranged over the sleeping bodies. Remember the communal sleeping arrangements? This was when they became most critical. Maximizing shared body heat under layers of scratchy fabric, you pull the rough wool up to your chin, feeling the collective warmth of your family next to you, a small, fragile bubble against the encroaching cold. A mainstream historical fact is that the medieval night was not simply dark, but profoundly so. Often without any artificial light beyond a tiny rushlight or candle, if you could afford one, after the main fire had been banked. This forced a reliance on auditory and tactile senses, making nighttime routines even more ritualistic and dependent on memory and habit. You knew where everything was in your hut by touch, moving in the absolute darkness with practiced ease. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some households might have used a bed-warming pan, not the brass ones you see in museums, but a simple pan filled with hot embers from the hearth, perhaps placed under the straw bedding for a few minutes before climbing in. Imagine the brief, intense burst of heat as you shift the pan around, quickly warming a small area before the chill reclaims it. It's a fleeting luxury. A quick sprint to get into a slightly less freezing bed. A small comfort before the long, cold hours of sleep. This leads us to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the concept of deep, uninterrupted sleep was common or even possible for medieval peasants, given the constant battle with cold, hunger, pests, and the need to periodically tend to the banked fire or animals. Did they experience fragmented sleep, waking frequently, or did sheer exhaustion allow them to fall into a profound slumber despite the discomforts? You lie on your straw pallet, listening to the wind howl outside, the faint sounds of your family breathing, and you wonder if sleep will offer true escape, or just a brief, cold pause before the dawn. These nighttime rituals were a daily act of defiance against the overwhelming power of winter. As you lay bundled on your straw pallet, the thought of adding another layer, any layer, to ward off the encroaching chill was paramount. While wool and linen formed the backbone of your everyday attire, the idea of animal skins often conjures images of luxury or primitive survival for the medieval peasant. However, their use was a complex blend of necessity and rarity, certainly not a common fashion statement. You might dream of wrapping yourself in a thick and insulating hide, but the reality was often far more meagre. For the vast majority of peasants, wearing large, unprocessed animal skins as regular clothing was uncommon. Such hides, unless meticulously tanned and processed, would be stiff, heavy, and quickly become foul-smelling when wet or worn close to the body. Imagine trying to move freely in a stiff, greasy cowhide, not exactly practical for working in the fields or spinning yarn. The processing required to turn a raw hide into usable leather or supple fur was often labor-intensive and beyond the everyday means or skills of every peasant family. However, smaller pieces of fur or sheepskin, particularly with the wool still attached, might be used as liners for cloaks, hoods, or gloves, adding a crucial layer of insulation. A simple sheepskin laid over a sleeping pallet could also provide significant warmth, acting as an extra barrier against the cold. If a family's own sheep were shorn, the wool would be processed, but the sheepskin itself might be kept for its insulating properties. A practical byproduct of animal husbandry, you might have a small, matted piece of sheepskin, its lanolin still providing a faint, comforting scent, which you carefully place over your chest at night. A mainstream historical fact is that leather, in its processed form, was widely used for footwear, belts, bags, and various tools, but large fur pelts were often a luxury item, associated with the wealthy elite. The sumptuary laws we mentioned earlier often restricted the wearing of certain furs to higher social classes, further limiting access for peasants. So, while you might wish for a bearskin cloak, you were generally making do with humble wool. Here's a quirky tidbit to prepare smaller furs or sheepskins for use as liners or simple coverings. Peasants might employ a rudimentary form of brain tanning. This ancient method uses the animal's own brains, which are surprisingly rich in emulsifying fats, to soften and preserve the hide. It sounds grotesque, but it's a highly effective, if messy, way to make a skin pliable without complex chemicals. Imagine the pungent aroma as you work a hide, knowing that this unpleasant task might provide just enough warmth to make it through the next cold snap. This leads us to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the limited use of animal skins by peasants was primarily due to the difficulty of processing them, the economic value of selling the raw hides or finished leather, or sumptuary laws that made their wearing illegal for commoners. Was it simply too much work, or was it more profitable to sell the raw material to a craftsman? Or were you literally forbidden from wearing anything too warm or luxurious? You might gaze longingly at a merchant's display of furs in the nearby town, knowing that such warmth is far beyond your reach, and resign yourself to another scratchy wool layer. The idea of animal skins as a luxury, rather than a necessity, highlights the stark class divisions even in matters of survival. As you battled the constant smoke from your central hearth, a faint hope for clearer air and more efficient heating slowly began to emerge. For centuries, the simple smoke hole in the roof was your primary, albeit woefully inadequate, ventilation system. But as the medieval period progressed, small advancements started to change the domestic landscape. The hesitant appearance of rudimentary smoke holes and chimneys. You might glimpse a more advanced structure in a wealthier village, a faint promise that one day, perhaps, your own home might be less filled with choking fumes. Initially, a smoke hole was exactly that, a hole in the roof, often directly above the central hearth, designed to let smoke escape. The problem, as you can imagine, was that it also let out heat and let in cold, rain, and snow. It was a constant compromise between suffocation and freezing. You'd wake up with a persistent cough, your eyes burning, the air thick with the acrid scent of wood smoke, a daily reminder of your home's primitive design. It's like having a hole in your blanket, but that hole is for air quality. Over time, this simple hole evolved. Sometimes, a louvre might be added, a sort of small, slatted structure on the roof that allowed smoke out while somewhat minimizing the ingress of weather. These were still far from modern chimneys, but represented a crucial step forward in managing indoor air. Then, gradually, came the true innovation, the wall fireplace with a projecting hood, and eventually, a proper chimney. This meant the fire could be moved from the center of the room to a wall, allowing the smoke to be drawn up a dedicated flue and out through a chimney stack. This significantly improved air quality, though it took time for these designs to filter down to peasant homes, often starting in manor houses and wealthier dwellings. A mainstream historical fact is that the widespread adoption of proper chimneys in domestic architecture was a slow process across medieval Europe, beginning in wealthier homes around the 12th or 13th centuries and gradually becoming more common. Though still not universal for peasants, and by the late medieval period, this technological advancement marked a significant improvement in living conditions, making homes healthier and more comfortable. Here's a quirky tidbit. Before the common use of purpose-built chimneys, some clever medieval inhabitants would suspend a large, bell-shaped hood, often made of wicker plastered with clay, directly over the hearth. This smoke hood would collect the smoke and channel it more directly towards the smoke hole or a simple opening in the wall, providing a more localized and slightly more effective smoke extraction than just letting it drift freely. Imagine this large, primitive exhaust fan hanging precariously over your fire, catching the worst of the fumes before they filled the entire room. It's a bit Heath Robinson, but it was a genuine attempt at improving their living conditions. This leads us to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the slow adoption of chimneys in peasant homes was primarily due to the expense of building materials, stone or brick, the lack of skilled masons, or simply the conservative nature of traditional building practices. Was it just too costly for a peasant to afford a stone chimney? Or was it that the knowledge and expertise to build one simply hadn't diffused widely enough into rural communities? You might look enviously at the Lord's manor, seeing the elegant chimney plume rising, and sigh, returning to your own smoky abode, dreaming of a day when you could breathe without your eyes watering. These innovations, while promising, were a slow march of progress for the common folk, while the smoke slowly, agonizingly, began to find its way out of your home. Another subtle, often unnoticed, factor contributed to your struggle against the cold, the very materials of your dwelling and their ability to act as thermal mass. You're not thinking about thermodynamics, but you instinctively feel the difference as the sun warms the rough stone of your wall, or how the earth beneath your floor seems to hold a lingering chill. Thermal mass refers to a material's ability to absorb, store, and release heat for medieval peasant homes, built primarily from earth, clay, stone, and timber. This property was a mixed blessing. Imagine your wattle and daub walls during the day. If the sun managed to peek through the perpetual cloud cover of winter, the daub, a mix of earth and clay, would slowly absorb some of that solar radiation. This stored heat would then be slowly radiated back into the dwelling after the sunset, providing a very gentle, passive warmth for a few hours. It's a bit like a giant, very slow-acting heat battery. Stone. If you were fortunate enough to have a stone foundation or a few stone walls, possessed even greater thermal mass. A thick stone wall would take a long time to heat up, but once warm, it would release that heat gradually over many hours. The hearth itself, especially if it had a stone or clay lining, would also absorb and radiate heat long after the flames had died down. Acting as a small, localized thermal battery, you might press your numb hand against the warm stone near the banked fire, feeling the lingering heat, a small comfort in the biting darkness. However, this thermal mass also had a downside, especially in winter. If the materials started cold, they stayed cold for a very long time, actively drawing heat away from you and your fire, the ground beneath your straw pallet. For example, especially if it was damp earth, was a constant source of cold, passively drawing your body heat away. You're trying to heat up the very structure you live in, a constant battle against the inherent properties of the building materials. It's like trying to warm up a giant. Cold rock with a single match. A mainstream historical fact is that vernacular architecture across many traditional societies instinctively utilized thermal mass principles long before the science was understood. Thick walls made of earth, stone, or even adobe were not just for structural integrity. They inherently moderated indoor temperatures, keeping interiors cooler in summer and, crucially, retaining heat in winter. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some medieval peasant homes, especially those built partially into a hillside or with earthen mounds piled against their northern walls, benefited from the insulating properties of the earth itself. The soil acts as a natural insulator, moderating temperature fluctuations and preventing deep frost from penetrating the dwelling. Similar to a root cellar, imagine burrowing into the earth for warmth. A primitive but effective way to minimize exposure to the harsh exterior temperatures. It's a natural form of passive heating and cooling, completely free, and surprisingly effective. This leads us to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether medieval builders had an intuitive, practical understanding of thermal mass and consciously designed for it, or if these benefits were merely incidental outcomes of using readily available, robust materials. Did they know that thick walls held heat, or did they simply build thick walls because they were durable and easy to construct with local materials? You're not contemplating the specific heat capacity of clay, but you certainly feel the difference between a thin, drafty wall and one that seems to hold a ghost of warmth from the day's fleeting sun. The interaction between human ingenuity and natural physics was a constant, often unconscious, dance in the pursuit of survival. Just as you thought you had a handle on the relentless cold, a larger, more menacing force loomed over the entire medieval period, the Little Ice Age. This wasn't just a particularly bad winter, it was a prolonged period of global cooling, an unforgiving shift in climate trends that made an already harsh existence even more brutal. You feel the chill, not just as a daily struggle, but as an ever-present, systemic pressure, knowing that winters are getting longer, colder, and more unforgiving with each passing year, beginning roughly in the 14th century and lasting well into the 19th century. The Little Ice Age brought colder average temperatures, longer and harsher winters, and shorter, less reliable summers across much of the Northern Hemisphere, including Europe. This wasn't a true ice age on the scale of glacial epochs, but its impact on a pre-industrial, agriculturally dependent society was catastrophic. Imagine trying to grow enough food for your family when the growing season is dramatically shortened, or when an early frost wipes out your entire harvest. The ground beneath your feet seems perpetually harder, the air always carrying a sharper bite. The consequences were far-reaching. Crop failures became more frequent and severe, leading to widespread famine and malnutrition. Frozen rivers and harbours disrupted trade and communication. Disease, already a constant threat, found even more fertile ground in populations weakened by hunger and cold. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, for instance, occurred just as the Little Ice Age was beginning to make its presence felt, leading to millions of deaths. You see the signs in your own village: fewer harvests, emptier granaries, and the constant gnawing fear in everyone's eyes. A mainstream historical fact is that the Little Ice Age significantly impacted European demography, agriculture, and even political stability. The colder climate contributed to increased social unrest, migration, and resource conflicts as populations struggled to adapt to declining yields and worsening living conditions. It fundamentally reshaped the medieval and early modern world. Here's a quirky tidbit. The increasing frequency of frozen rivers and lakes during the Little Ice Age led to the development of new pastimes, such as ice skating and ice games, particularly in Northern Europe. While dangerous and certainly not a peasant luxury, the ability to walk or skate across previously uncrossable frozen bodies of water also offered new and often perilous routes for travel and trade in winter. Imagine a brief moment of wonder, seeing figures glide across a frozen river, a rare beauty born of brutal cold. This leads us to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue about the precise causes of the Little Ice Age, with theories ranging from decreased solar activity and increased volcanic activity to changes in ocean currents. Was it a natural, cyclical phenomenon, or were there specific, identifiable triggers that pushed the climate into this colder phase? You're certainly not contemplating sunspots or volcanic ash, but you feel its undeniable presence every time you shiver, every time you look at the barren fields, and every time another winter stretches endlessly before you. The unrelenting chill was a force of nature beyond human comprehension or control. When the cold became an almost spiritual adversary, the medieval peasant often turned to forces beyond the tangible, superstitions and beliefs. In a world where science offered few answers and control over your environment was minimal, folk remedies, charms, and rituals were a desperate, hopeful attempt to influence the elements and ward off winter's chill and its associated calamities. You tie a small amulet around your neck, a piece of dried herb or a polished stone, hoping it will deflect the creeping cold and unseen spirits that bring illness. These beliefs were deeply interwoven with daily life. You might hear whispers of specific moon phases being auspicious for gathering certain herbs to ward off winter coughs, or that hanging a particular symbol above your door would keep frost from your dwelling. Some might believe that ringing church bells vigorously could break up a coming snowstorm, or that making certain offerings at crossroads would appease the spirits of winter. It's a mix of ancient pagan practices subtly blended with Christian beliefs, a desperate attempt to find patterns and exert some control over the uncontrollable. You rub a small, worn piece of wood, a charm against the biting wind, feeling a tiny flicker of hope that it might just work. Many of these practices focused on protection from illness, which, as you know, was a huge threat in winter. Charms against the cold sickness. Herbal poultices applied with specific incantations or rituals to cleanse the home of malevolent spirits thought to bring fever were common. While we understand the microbial causes of disease now, for the medieval peasant, Illness was often attributed to unseen forces, witchcraft, or divine displeasure, making magical or spiritual interventions feel entirely logical. You try to remember the exact words for the blessing your grandmother taught you, hoping they'll protect your shivering child. A mainstream historical fact is that superstition and folk magic were pervasive across all levels of medieval society, not just among the peasantry, while the church condemned outright paganism. Many practices persisted, often reinterpreted through a Christian lens, illustrating the human need to find meaning and exert agency in a world filled with uncertainty and hardship. Here's a quirky tidbit about warding off winter ills. Some peasants would hang specific dried animal parts, a badger's claw, a snake's skin, or even a dried frog, above their door or hearth, believing these would absorb or repel the cold and prevent illness from entering the home. Imagine stepping into your hut and seeing a shriveled animal charm dangling from the rafters. A rather macabre piece of home decor, but one imbued with powerful meaning and desperate hope. It's certainly not something you'd see in a modern home, unless you're into very niche taxidermy. This leads us to an open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether these superstitious practices provided genuine psychological comfort and resilience in the face of adversity, or if they ultimately diverted energy and resources from more practical survival strategies. Did believing in a charm make you feel better and thus more capable of enduring? Or did it waste precious time that could have been spent gathering more firewood? You might perform a small ritual, knowing deep down it might not change anything, but feeling a tiny bit better for having tried. The line between practicality and magical thinking was often blurred when survival was on the line. Amidst the relentless daily grind of surviving the medieval winter, there were brief, precious moments of respite, sparks of joy that punctuated the long, cold months, the winter festivals. These weren't just an excuse for a party, they were vital social and psychological outlets, offering temporary relief from the drudgery, a chance for communal celebration, and a reminder that spring, eventually, would return. You feel a rare lightness in your step, the promise of a feast, however humble, breaking through the pervasive chill. The most significant winter festival, of course, was Christmas. While not celebrated with the commercial fervor of today, it was a profound religious observance lasting several days, often extending into the new year for peasants. This might mean a temporary reprieve from labor, a slightly more abundant meal, perhaps even a rare taste of meat if the Lord provided a traditional Christmas feast for his tenants, or if a communal animal was slaughtered, and a focus on spiritual renewal. You might gather with your neighbors at the church, sharing simple songs and stories. The warmth of human connection, a powerful antidote to the physical cold. Other winter celebrations included the 12 days of Christmas, culminating in Epiphany, and local saints' days. These were occasions for communal gatherings, perhaps some rough music, dancing, and the sharing of whatever food and drink could be mustered. While the celebrations were modest by modern standards, they were incredibly important for morale. Imagine the dark, cold nights suddenly illuminated by the flicker of torches, the sound of laughter replacing the usual somber silence, the brief feeling of abundance in a season of scarcity. It's a moment to forget, if only for a few hours, the freezing toes and aching muscles. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval festivals, both religious and secular, played a critical role in structuring the agricultural year and providing essential psychological breaks for a population whose lives were otherwise relentlessly demanding. These periods of rest and celebration were not just culturally significant, they were a vital part of maintaining social cohesion and mental well-being. Here's a quirky tidbit about medieval winter revelry. During some festivals, particularly around Yuletide, there might have been the tradition of a Lord of Misrule or similar figures, where social hierarchies were temporarily inverted, and commoners would playfully mock or take on the roles of their superiors. Imagine your gruff neighbor, usually bowed under the weight of toil, suddenly prancing about, pretending to be the lord, to the delighted laughter of the village. It's a release valve for social tensions, a brief period of licensed anarchy before returning to the strictures of daily life. This leads us to an open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the apparent joyousness of these winter festivals truly reflected peasant sentiment, or if they were largely mandated occasions designed by the church and nobility to control popular discontent and maintain social order. Were these genuine expressions of communal celebration, or merely enforced opportunities for the powerful to provide a temporary, superficial appeasement? You feel the warmth of the communal fire, the taste of the slightly richer ale, and for a fleeting moment, the cold outside doesn't seem quite so oppressive. These festivals were a precious, if temporary, escape from the brutal realities, a glimmer of light in the long, dark winter. As you hunkered down in your village, the thought of venturing beyond its familiar, if cold, confines filled you with dread. Travelling in winter during the medieval period was not a romantic journey. It was an undertaking fraught with extreme peril, a desperate measure often driven by dire necessity rather than choice. You watch the few brave or foolish souls who dare to leave, their bundled figures quickly disappearing into the swirling snow or mist. Knowing that their chances of reaching their destination safely are slim, the roads, if they could even be called that, were often little more than muddy tracks in good weather. In winter, they transformed into treacherous quagmires of frozen mud, slick ice, or deep, impassable snowdrifts. Rivers froze, making crossings unpredictable and dangerous, while bridges were few and far between. Even a short journey to a nearby market town could become a life-threatening ordeal. Imagine trying to navigate uneven terrain with crude footwear, battling blizzards, with no reliable maps or signposts. Every step is a gamble, every turn a potential dead end. The dangers weren't just environmental. The extreme cold meant a constant risk of hypothermia and frostbite. If you were delayed, if your cart broke down, if you lost your way, there was no warm inn around every corner. Exposure was a swift and brutal killer. Bandits, though perhaps less active in the coldest weather, remained a threat, preying on vulnerable travellers. Without modern communication, if you ran into trouble, there was no one to call for help. You're alone with the vast, unforgiving winter landscape, relying solely on your own wits and endurance. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval travel in general was slow, dangerous, and expensive, significantly limiting movement for the vast majority of the population. Winter exacerbated all these challenges exponentially, often bringing commerce and communication to a near standstill outside of the most robust and well-maintained routes. People only travelled in winter if they absolutely had to, for urgent family matters, for trade that couldn't wait, or out of sheer desperation like fleeing famine. Here's a quirky tidbit. To mark paths and help travellers navigate through deep snow or fog, some medieval communities might use waystones or cairns, piles of stones deliberately placed at intervals. While rudimentary, these simple markers could literally be lifesavers, offering a visual guide in whiteout conditions where familiar landmarks were obscured. Imagine seeing a faint outline of a cairn through the swirling snow, a tiny beacon of hope indicating you're still on the right path. It's a small, human touch in an otherwise desolate and dangerous journey. This leads us to an open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether medieval people understood the true scale of the risks involved in winter travel, or if necessity often forced them into journeys that were essentially suicidal. Did they truly underestimate the dangers, or was the alternative starvation, eviction, failure to pay dues, even worse than the slim chance of survival on the road? You push forward, each step an act of grim determination, knowing that turning back might mean a worse fate than facing the storm head-on. The cold wind howls around you, a constant reminder of the incredible bravery or sheer desperation it took to journey in medieval winter. As the medieval winter truly set in, another critical aspect of daily survival became a monumental challenge: water management. You take for granted turning on a tap for clean, running water. But for the medieval peasant, water was a constant struggle, especially when sources froze, when snow piled high, and when daily needs still demanded a consistent supply. You chip away at the ice on your water barrel, your fingers aching with the cold, knowing that every drop is precious. Your primary water sources were typically wells, natural springs, or nearby rivers and streams. In winter, these often froze solid or were covered in thick ice. This meant an arduous daily task of breaking through ice to draw water, or melting snow and ice over your precious hearth fire. Imagine the energy expenditure, hauling heavy buckets of ice or snow, then burning valuable fuel wood to melt it, only to have it freeze again overnight. Every drop of water for cooking, drinking, and basic hygiene, which was already minimal, came at a significant cost in labor and fuel. You watch the water slosh precariously in the bucket as you carry it back to your hut, trying not to spill a single, hard-won drop. The quality of water was also a constant concern. Surface water from rivers and streams was often contaminated by human and animal waste, making it a source of disease. Even well water could be suspect. This is why fermented drinks were so popular. The boiling process in brewing largely sterilized the water. In winter, as frozen conditions limited access to flowing water, stagnant pools or compromised wells became even more risky. You'd instinctively gravitate towards the cleanest-looking snow or the clearest ice, but there was no guarantee of purity. A mainstream historical fact is that access to clean, reliable water sources was a major public health challenge throughout the medieval period, contributing significantly to disease outbreaks. The challenges compounded in winter, making the simple act of staying hydrated a constant, perilous endeavor. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some extremely cold regions, medieval communities might have practiced a form of ice harvesting. Large blocks of clear ice would be cut from frozen lakes or ponds and stored in insulated pits or rudimentary ice houses, often just a hole in the ground covered with straw and earth, for use later in the winter or even into spring. While not for drinking, this ice could be used for preserving food or providing a cold source for other needs. Imagine the collective effort, men sawing massive blocks of ice, pulling them across the frozen landscape, a testament to their ingenuity in harnessing natural resources, even in their most solid form. This leads us to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether medieval communities fully grasped the link between contaminated water and illness, or if their practices, like drinking ale, were simply pragmatic responses to observed effects without a full scientific understanding. Did they consciously avoid stagnant water because they knew it made people sick, or just because it tasted bad and looked murky? You might not articulate germ theory, but you know instinctively that drinking from a certain puddle makes you feel ill, and that the melted snow, however cold, feels somehow cleaner. The simple act of obtaining usable water was a daily struggle, a victory against the freezing, unforgiving environment. While you worried about your own survival in the bitter cold, an equally pressing concern, and often a matter of life and death for your household, was animal care. Your livestock, your oxen, cows, sheep, chickens, and pigs weren't just sources of food, they were assets, laborers, and often the difference between your family's survival and destitution. Protecting them through the winter was, in essence, protecting your own life. You check on the shivering animals in their makeshift shelter, your breath pluming in the frigid air. Knowing their well-being directly impacts yours. Firstly, shelter. Your animals needed protection from the direct wind, snow, and rain. This might mean a rudimentary stable or lean-to attached to your own dwelling, or a communal village byre. These structures were rarely well insulated, but they offered a vital barrier against the worst of the elements. You'd muck them out regularly, a freezing, unpleasant chore, but essential for preventing disease and keeping the animals as comfortable as possible. The collective body heat of the animals themselves would also contribute, much like your own family's shared warmth, creating a slightly less frigid environment. Secondly, food and water. Pastures were covered in snow or frozen solid, so animals relied entirely on stored fodder, hay, dried leaves, and whatever grain scraps could be spared. This was a constant drain on your already limited resources. Watering was equally challenging, requiring daily trips to break ice on ponds or carry water from wells. A sick or starving animal was a disaster, representing lost labor, lost food, and lost potential for offspring. You carefully dole out a small portion of hay, watching your cow chew slowly, her breath steaming, a silent prayer that she'll make it through. A mainstream historical fact is that livestock was an incredibly valuable asset for medieval peasants, often representing their primary form of wealth and a vital part of their subsistence economy. The loss of an animal due to winter conditions could be a catastrophic blow, leading to ruin for a peasant family. Here's a quirky tidbit about winter animal care in extremely harsh winters, or for very valuable animals like draft oxen. Some peasants might try to feed them winter greens from stored root vegetables, like turnips or parsnips, or even specially cultivated winter kale, if possible. This provided much-needed vitamins and moisture that dry hay lacked, helping to keep the animals healthier. Imagine carefully chopping up a frozen turnip for your ox, a small luxury that you hope will keep him strong enough for the spring ploughing. This leads us to an open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the high mortality rates for livestock in medieval winters were primarily due to extreme weather, the lack of sufficient fodder, or a limited understanding of animal diseases and veterinary care. Was it simply too cold and too little food? Or were there widespread illnesses that they had no means to combat? You might try every folk remedy you know for a shivering lamb, desperately hoping to save it, knowing that its survival is tied directly to your family's fate. The struggle to keep animals alive was a constant, anxious battle, a mirror of your own fight against the unforgiving cold, with the last harvests long past and the winter winds howling. One of your most pressing concerns was simply having enough to eat. This brought you to the crucial, often ingenious, methods of food storage, preserving sustenance for the long haul. You gaze at your dwindling stores, carefully arranged in the coolest, driest parts of your hut or in a small, earthen cellar, knowing that every apple, every dried piece of meat, represents calories and survival in the lean months ahead. Medieval peasants relied heavily on techniques that didn't require refrigeration, which, of course, was centuries away. Drying was a primary method. Grains like wheat, barley, and oats were harvested and then thoroughly dried to prevent spoilage from mold and pests. These would be stored in sacks or large bins, often in a loft or a dedicated shed, carefully protected from rodents. Vegetables, too, could be dried. Peas and beans were hulled and sun-dried, while some root vegetables might be thinly sliced and air-dried, though this was less common due to the effort involved. You'd run your hand over the rough burlap of a grain sack, feeling the hard kernels within, a tangible comfort. Another common method was salting and smoking, especially for meat and fish. If you were fortunate enough to have a pig slaughtered, or if you caught fish, every usable part would be preserved. Meat would be heavily salted, drawing out moisture and inhibiting bacterial growth, then often hung in a smokehouse or near a fire to cure slowly. Infusing it with preservative smoke, this imparted a strong flavor, but more importantly, kept the meat edible for months. Imagine the pungent, smoky aroma clinging to the rafters, a promise of protein in the depths of winter. Root vegetables like carrots, parsnips, turnips, and potatoes, after their introduction later in the period, were stored in cool, dark, and slightly damp conditions, often in earthen cellars, root cellars, or covered pits dug into the ground. These conditions kept them from freezing but prevented them from sprouting or rotting too quickly. Apples and other hard fruits could also be stored this way. Carefully layered with straw or sand, you'd descend into the damp coolness of your small cellar, carefully selecting a turnip, grateful for its robust longevity. A mainstream historical fact is that food preservation techniques were highly sophisticated for their time, relying on empirical knowledge passed down through generations. Without these methods, widespread famine would have been even more frequent and devastating, especially given the lack of interseasonal food transport. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some medieval households might have made a primitive form of cheese from sour milk, which, when heavily salted and dried, could last for a surprising amount of time. This wasn't the creamy delight you know today, but a hard, pungent, and incredibly dense source of calories and protein, often grated into porridges or stews. Imagine chipping off a piece of incredibly hard, salty cheese. A small, highly concentrated burst of flavor and sustenance. It's a testament to their ingenuity in squeezing every bit of edible value out of their limited resources. This leads us to an open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the reliance on heavily preserved foods in winter led to widespread cases of specific nutritional deficiencies that weren't immediately obvious, such as scurvy, vitamin C deficiency, or if their supplementary intake of foraged wild plants, even dried, somehow compensated. Did the lack of fresh greens for months at a time truly lead to chronic ill health? Or did they possess a more robust diet than we often assume? You chew on a piece of hard, smoked fish, grateful for the calories, but perhaps unconsciously craving something fresh and green that won't appear again for months. The subtle battle against hidden hunger was a constant undercurrent to your winter survival, as you focused on keeping warm and well-fed. Another relentless pressure continued to bear down on you. Even in the depths of winter, the Lord's demands, feudal obligations, taxes, labor, and various dues did not simply evaporate with the first snowflake. They remained a constant, heavy burden, often making the already brutal winter even more challenging for the medieval peasant. You clench your jaw, thinking of the portion of your meager stores, or the days of your dwindling energy, that you must surrender to the manor. Your life, as a serf or tenant farmer, was inextricably linked to the lord of the manor. You held your land from him, and in return, you owed him various services and payments. In winter, while the primary agricultural labor might lessen, other obligations persisted. You might still be called upon for corvée labor, performing tasks like repairing manor buildings, maintaining fences, clearing snow from the lord's roads, or chopping firewood for the manor house. This meant taking time away from your own survival efforts, using your limited energy to benefit someone else. Imagine being forced to clear a path through deep snow to the lord's castle, your fingers numb, knowing your own family needs that same effort back in your hut. Beyond labor, you owed various dues and taxes, often in kind. This could mean a portion of your stored grain, a number of eggs, a piece of cured meat, or even a specific amount of firewood, while some flexibility might be granted in the harshest conditions. The overall expectation of payment remained. Failing to meet these obligations could lead to harsh penalties, including fines, confiscation of property, or even eviction, a terrifying prospect in winter. You carefully count out the last of your dried peas, knowing a portion will go to the Lord, leaving even less for your own hungry family. A mainstream historical fact is that the feudal system, while providing a degree of social stability and protection, in theory, placed significant economic and labor burdens on the peasantry. These obligations were a constant feature of their lives, regardless of seasonal hardship, highlighting the systemic vulnerability of the peasant class. Here's a quirky tidbit about these demands. Sometimes, especially during harsh winters, a lord might host a winter audit or collection day where peasants would bring their dues to the manor house, while often a day of anxiety. It could also be an opportunity for the lord to display a limited form of patronage, perhaps offering a hot meal or a tankard of ale to those who had paid their dues, or even granting a small, temporary reprieve to those truly suffering. Imagine the mixed feelings as you approach the manor, dreading the payment but hoping for a moment of communal warmth or a sympathetic ear. This leads us to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether medieval lords typically exercised leniency towards their peasants during extreme winter hardship, or if they rigidly enforced their demands, prioritizing their own needs above the suffering of their tenants. Was there a practical understanding that starving peasants couldn't work in the spring, leading to some flexibility? Or was the system fundamentally exploitative, pushing peasants to the brink? You feel the cold weight of the feudal system, a pressure as relentless as the winter itself, constantly reminding you of your place and your duties, given the immense difficulties of staying warm and fed. You might wonder if there was any thought of escaping the grip of a brutal medieval winter entirely. This brings us to the question of migration patterns, seeking warmer pastures, literally, to survive. While the concept of a winter getaway sounds appealing, for the vast majority of medieval peasants, large-scale seasonal migration was an almost impossible dream, a rare and desperate act rather than a common strategy. You might hear whispers of distant lands where the sun always shines, but the idea of reaching them is as fantastical as flying. For one, the means of travel were incredibly primitive. As you remember from our discussion on winter journeys, moving an entire family, with meagre possessions and perhaps a few animals. Across frozen, dangerous landscapes was an undertaking that few could contemplate, let alone achieve. There were no trains, no cars, no organized transport. Every mile was a physically demanding, perilous ordeal, compounded by the constant threat of starvation and exposure. You might look at the frozen horizon, wondering if there's a warmer place. But the sheer logistical nightmare of getting there quickly squashes any hopeful thought. Secondly, you were tied to the land. As a serf or tenant, you generally weren't free to pick up and leave. Your labour, your dues, and your very existence were bound to the lord of the manor. Abandoning your land without permission could result in severe penalties, potentially even death, while some might flee due to extreme hardship, becoming vagrants. This was a last resort, a desperate act of survival rather than a planned migration. You might dream of escaping the Lord's grip and the relentless cold, but the chains that bind you are stronger than any winter storm. However, there were limited forms of seasonal movement, primarily for those involved in certain trades. Shepherds, for example, might move their flocks to lower, more sheltered pastures during the harshest months, a form of transhumance. But this was specific to pastoral communities and not widespread among arable farmers. Some highly specialized craftsmen or merchants might have followed trade routes that offered slightly warmer conditions, but again, this was far from the peasant experience. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval society was largely static in terms of population movement, especially for the peasantry. The vast majority of people lived and died within a few miles of their birthplace, their lives deeply rooted in their local village and its surrounding lands. Large-scale, organized migrations were rare, usually only occurring in response to catastrophic events like widespread famine, plague, or warfare. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some coastal or riverine communities, during periods of extreme winter freezing, there might have been temporary, desperate migrations towards the unfrozen waters to try and fish, or collect shellfish, or access ice-free trade routes that offered a chance for sustenance. Imagine a small group of villagers, driven by hunger, venturing out onto the treacherous, partially frozen coastline, risking their lives for a chance at a meal. It's a testament to the sheer desperation that the cold could induce. This leads us to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the concept of winter homelessness and vagrancy was a significant, if undocumented, form of internal migration during particularly harsh winters, or if those who left their lands simply perished quickly from exposure. Did a significant number of peasants become displaced, constantly seeking temporary refuge, or did the vast majority simply die in their homes or in nearby ditches if they left? You feel the chill permeating your very being, and the thought of leaving the limited shelter of your hut, even for the promise of a warmer horizon, seems utterly terrifying, an almost certain path to an icy demise. As you spend long, dark hours huddled indoors, the sensory experience of a medieval winter home was profound and often, frankly, overpowering. Forget the fresh scent of pine or baking cookies, instead. You were enveloped by the smell of winter, a potent, omnipresent blend of smoke, animals, and stale air that permeated everything. You take a breath, and the familiar, heavy scent fills your lungs. A constant reminder of your enclosed, unventilated existence. The most dominant aroma was, undoubtedly, smoke, your central hearth, with its rudimentary smoke hole or early chimney, constantly filled the dwelling with wood smoke. This wasn't just a faint, pleasant campfire smell. It was a thick, acrid, eye-watering haze that clung to your clothes, your hair, the very fabric of your straw bedding. Every piece of fabric, every wooden beam, every person carried this distinctive scent. You didn't just smell smoky, you were smoky. It's a smell that probably permeated your dreams and stayed with you even when you ventured outside. Then, there was the pervasive scent of animals. Whether it was the livestock you brought indoors for warmth, remember that quirky tidbit from section 4? The chickens scratching in a corner? or simply the pervasive odor of undeterred rodents. The air was thick with the earthy, often pungent smell of living creatures. Add to this the general lack of personal hygiene, infrequent bathing, limited changes of clothes, and you have a complex bouquet of human and animal effluvia. You might try to ignore it, but your nose, much like the rest of your senses, is constantly assaulted. Finally, the stale air, with tightly shut doors and windows or rudimentary coverings. Ventilation was minimal, leading to a stagnant, heavy atmosphere. The air was laden with the smells of food preparation, human breath, unwashed bodies, and the lingering dampness of cold. Compressed straw. There was no fresh breeze circulating, no opening a window for a few minutes to air out the room. The air you breathed was a microcosm of your existence, recycled and dense. It's a far cry from the crisp, clean air you might associate with winter today. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval dwellings, particularly peasant homes, were often incredibly unhygienic by modern standards, leading to persistent odors and contributing to the spread of disease. Our modern sensibilities regarding cleanliness and air quality would find them almost unbearable. Here's a quirky tidbit about these winter smells. Some sources suggest that medieval homes might deliberately burn certain aromatic herbs like rosemary or juniper berries on the fire, not just for their scent, but perhaps in a folk belief that the smoke from these herbs would cleanse the air or ward off illness. Imagine a faint, fleeting scent of something pleasant, battling bravely against the overwhelming aroma of smoke and animal musk. It's a tiny, desperate attempt at medieval air freshening. This leads us to an open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether medieval people were simply accustomed to these pervasive odors and barely noticed them, or if they suffered from the constant sensory assault but simply had no means to improve it. Did their olfactory senses dull, making the smells a background hum, or were they constantly aware of the unpleasantness, but resigned to it? You certainly don't wrinkle your nose every time you enter your hut. This is simply the smell of home, the smell of survival in winter. But a stray thought might surface. Will spring ever come to blow these heavy smells away, with the long, dark, and often pungent nights stretching endlessly before you, and outdoor work significantly curtailed by the brutal cold, your mind, much like your hands, sought occupation? This is where storytelling and lore came into their own, becoming a vital lifeline for entertainment, education, and community bonding during those long, cold hours. You settle closer to the banked fire, listening to the familiar voice of an elder, their words weaving tales that momentarily transport you far from the immediate chill. In a world without books, radio, television, or the internet, oral tradition was paramount. Stories were not just for children, they were for everyone. You'd gather around the flickering light of the hearth, listening intently as elders recounted tales of local heroes, ancient legends, moral fables, or even news from distant villages, often embellished. Of course, these stories served multiple purposes. They preserved history, transmitted cultural values, taught practical lessons, and, most importantly, provided a much-needed escape from the monotony and hardship of daily life. You hang on every word, your imagination painting vivid pictures in the smoky shadows. Riddles, songs, and even simple games would also fill the long hours. The ability to tell a good story, to recall a vast repertoire of lore, or to sing a rousing tune was a highly valued skill. It fostered community, strengthened social bonds, and created moments of shared humanity that transcended the physical discomforts. Imagine the warmth generated not just by the fire, but by the laughter and shared sighs of a group captivated by a tale. It's a different kind of warmth, one that settles deep in your soul. A mainstream historical fact is that oral culture was the dominant form of information transfer and entertainment in medieval peasant society. Literacy was rare, and books were precious commodities, usually confined to monasteries or the wealthiest elites. Consequently, memory, storytelling, and communal recitation were highly developed skills. Here's a quirky tidbit about medieval winter entertainment. Sometimes, travelling performers, like minstrels or wandering storytellers, might pass through a village, offering their services in exchange for food, lodging, or a few coins. Their arrival would be a major event, a break from the usual routine, bringing news, songs, and stories from beyond your familiar world. Imagine the excitement as word spreads that a minstrel is in the village, promising an evening of captivating tales and perhaps even a new tune to hum. It's a fleeting moment of professional entertainment in a world where almost all leisure was self-made. This leads us to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the content of medieval peasant storytelling primarily reflected their daily struggles and anxieties, e.g., tales of overcoming hardship, warding off evil, or if they primarily served as escapist fantasy, focusing on heroic quests and magical realms far removed from their reality. Did they tell stories to process their suffering, or to forget it entirely? You find yourself drawn to tales of courage and warmth, even as the cold reminds you of your own reality, recognizing that even in the bleakest times, the human spirit yearns for narrative and connection. The glow of the fire, the hushed voices, the shared stories, these were moments that made the winter bearable. Amidst the stories and the shared warmth of communal life, one resource stood out as truly indispensable, especially during winter: the value of firewood. This wasn't just a commodity, it was quite literally a matter of life and death, a precious resource whose acquisition, storage, and judicious use dictated whether your family would endure the cold or succumb to its relentless grip. You look at your dwindling woodpile, each log representing precious warmth, a tangible manifestation of your constant struggle. As we discussed, your hearth was the only source of heat in your home, and it demanded a constant, hungry supply of fuel. Without firewood, there was no cooking, no warmth, and no way to melt snow for water. Every piece of wood you gathered or chopped was a piece of future survival. This meant spending countless hours in the freezing woods, often battling snow and ice, to collect fallen branches, deadwood, or to coppice smaller trees. The labor was immense, the reward essential. You feel the ache in your back and arms, a testament to the endless chore of gathering fuel. Firewood was also a form of currency for peasants. It might be part of the dues owed to the lord, or it could be bartered for other necessities at the village market. If you had a surplus, a rare luxury, it could be traded for grain, tools, or even a rare piece of cloth. This economic value underscored its importance. It wasn't just fuel, it was a fundamental asset in the peasant economy. Imagine having to decide between burning a precious log for warmth tonight or saving it to trade for a new tool that might make next year's harvest easier. A mainstream historical fact is that access to fuel, particularly firewood, was a major concern throughout medieval Europe, leading to strict regulations, common rights disputes, and even conflicts over forest resources. The availability of wood directly influenced population density and agricultural practices, as communities couldn't thrive without a reliable heat source. Here's a quirky tidbit about medieval firewood. To maximize efficiency and ensure a longer burn, peasants might practice rudimentary forms of seasoning wood. This involved stacking freshly cut wood in a sheltered, airy spot for months, sometimes even a year, to allow it to dry out. Drier wood burns hotter and cleaner, producing less smoke and more usable heat. Imagine the foresight required to cut wood in summer or autumn for the following winter, knowing that patience would pay off in precious warmth when you needed it most. It's a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of fuel dynamics. This leads us to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the apparent deforestation in some medieval European regions was primarily due to peasant fuel demands, or large-scale agricultural expansion, or the timber needs of burgeoning industries and urban centres. Was it your constant need for firewood that stripped the landscape, or were larger economic forces at play? You might feel a pang of guilt as you chop down another small tree, knowing the forest seems thinner than it once was. But the immediate need for warmth overrides any long-term ecological concerns. The preciousness of firewood was a constant, tangible reality, shaping your daily decisions and defining your winter existence. With the great outdoors becoming an increasingly inhospitable place, winter forced much of your activity indoors. This shift brought a focus on crafting and mending. Essential indoor winter occupations that filled the long, dark hours and ensured your household remained functional and prepared for the warmer months. You settle near the dim light of the hearth, your hands busy with familiar tasks, the rhythm of work a comfort against the pervasive cold. For women, spinning was a constant chore. Raw wool or flax, prepared in the warmer months, would be spun into thread using a drop spindle or a simple spinning wheel. This thread would then be used for weaving cloth on a loom, a less common household item, often communal, or, more likely, for knitting or sewing garments. Imagine the continuous hum of the spinning wheel, or the rhythmic click of knitting needles. As yarn slowly takes shape, every thread, every stitch, was a direct contribution to the family's warmth and survival. You pull the rough thread, feeling its texture, knowing it will soon be part of a new tunic or a patch for an old one. Men, too, had their indoor tasks. Tools needed repair, sharpening blades, replacing wooden handles, mending broken parts. Leather goods, like shoes and belts, required patching and re-oiling. Baskets might be woven from rushes or willow branches gathered earlier in the year. Small wooden implements could be carved or repaired. These tasks weren't just about passing the time, they were crucial for maintaining the equipment essential for farming and daily life. A broken plough in spring meant a failed harvest. So winter was the time to ensure everything was ready. You carefully sharpen a dull knife. The rhythmic scrape of stone against metal, a familiar sound in the quiet hut. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval peasant households were largely self-sufficient, producing most of their own food, clothing, and tools. Winter was a crucial period for this domestic production, as outdoor agricultural work was limited, allowing time for essential crafts and repairs that directly contributed to the household's economy and survival. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some peasant families might engage in rushlight making during the long winter evenings. This involved stripping the outer layer from rushes, a type of wetland plant, soaking the pith in rendered animal fat, tallow, and then drying them. These simple, flickering lights provided a very dim but crucial illumination for indoor tasks after dark, allowing work to continue even after the embers of the fire had died down significantly. Imagine the faint, greasy smell of burning tallow, a tiny beacon in the profound darkness, allowing you to mend a crucial tear in a garment. This leads us to an open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the apparent idle time of medieval winter was genuinely a period of rest and leisure for peasants, or if it was simply a shift from outdoor agricultural labour to equally demanding, but indoor, domestic and craft production. Was it a welcome break, or just a change of scenery for their relentless toil? You might sigh with weariness, but there's also a grim satisfaction in seeing your pile of spun yarn grow, or a tool repaired, knowing that your efforts now will pay dividends in the warmer, busier seasons. These indoor occupations were a testament to their resourcefulness and constant preparedness. As the medieval winter dragged on, its relentless grip wasn't just physical, it had a profound psychological impact. While you were constantly fighting the cold and hunger, another, more insidious battle was waged within, the dreams of spring and the mental toll of the seemingly endless dark. Cold months, you gaze out at the bleak, snow-covered landscape, feeling the weight of the endless grey skies, and a deep yearning for warmth and light takes hold of your very spirit. The monotony of winter was soul-crushing, day after day, the same tasks, the same limited diet, the same pervasive cold. The lack of sunlight, especially in northern latitudes, affected mood and energy levels. The constant threat of illness, the high mortality rates among children and the elderly, and the ever-present fear of famine created an atmosphere of anxiety and apprehension. You feel a creeping weariness, a profound sense of exhaustion that goes beyond physical fatigue, settling deep within your bones. But even amidst this hardship, the human spirit clung to hope. The dreams of spring were not just idle fantasies, they were a vital psychological coping mechanism. You would look forward to the first thaw, the lengthening days, the green shoots emerging from the frozen earth, and the promise of a new harvest. These were concrete signs that the cycle would turn, that abundance would return, and that the long, dark season of scarcity would eventually end. You imagine the vibrant colours of wildflowers, the feeling of warm sun on your face, clinging to these mental images as if they were tangible warmth. Winter festivals, as we discussed, offered brief, structured moments of respite and communal joy, but the intervening weeks were a test of endurance. Stories and lore provided escapism, but the harsh reality always returned. The ability to find resilience, to maintain hope in the face of such overwhelming odds, was a testament to the strength of the medieval peasant spirit. You remind yourself that this, too, shall pass. Focusing on the future rather than dwelling on the present discomfort. A mainstream historical fact is that seasonal affective disorder, SAD, while not understood scientifically until much later, likely impacted medieval populations due to the significantly reduced daylight hours and prolonged periods of cold, isolation, and limited activity. The human body's response to lack of light and warmth is universal, regardless of the century. Here's a quirky tidbit. To combat the psychological gloom of winter, some medieval households might cultivate a few hardy, fast-growing herbs or even forced bulbs indoors near the hearth, often in small clay pots. These winter gardens provided a tiny splash of green and a fresh scent in an otherwise barren environment, a visual and olfactory reminder that life persisted even in the cold, and that spring would indeed come. Imagine a tiny, struggling green sprout in a dusty pot, a powerful symbol of hope and rebirth in your smoky, dim hut. This leads us to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the medieval peasants' resignation to their harsh fate was primarily a form of fatalism deeply rooted in religious belief, or a pragmatic acceptance born of a lack of perceived alternatives and control. Was it a spiritual surrender, or simply a realistic assessment of their limited agency? You might offer a prayer for spring, but you also prepare your tools for the thaw, knowing that both faith and practical action are necessary. The psychological landscape of medieval winter was as challenging as the physical one, a constant interplay between grim reality and the enduring hope for warmth and renewal. As you settled into the forced intimacy of your medieval winter home, there were certain unwelcome guests that didn't pay rent but were impossible to evict. Pest infestations, rodents and insects, much like yourself, sought shelter from the biting cold, turning your humble dwelling into a bustling, albeit unhygienic, refuge for unwanted winter guests. You hear the faint scratching in the walls, the skittering across the floor in the dark, and you know you are far from alone in your hut. Mice and rats were a constant menace. They would chew through precious grain sacks, contaminate food stores, and spread disease. With outdoor food sources scarce in winter, your stored grains and dried provisions became an irresistible target. Imagine waking in the night to the sound of gnawing, knowing that your family's winter sustenance is slowly being devoured by tiny, furry invaders. There were no sophisticated traps or exterminators. You relied on cats, if you had one and it was a good hunter, or simply tried to protect your food as best you could in solid containers. Insects, too, thrived in the warmer, enclosed environment. Fleas and lice were a constant companion, especially with infrequent bathing and shared sleeping arrangements. These aren't just an annoyance, they're carriers of disease, making you perpetually itchy and miserable. Bedbugs, nesting in straw pallets, would emerge at night to feed. You scratch an incessant itch, knowing that relief is temporary and the tiny tormentors are always present. Beyond the creepy crawlies, winter also brought a heightened risk of fungal growth and mold, especially in damp, unventilated homes. This could affect stored food, making it inedible, and contribute to respiratory problems for the inhabitants. You notice the dark patches on the wall, the musty smell. Another symptom of your challenging living conditions. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval urban and rural environments were characterized by pervasive pest problems, which significantly contributed to poor public health and the spread of epidemics like the Black Death carried by fleas on rats. The concept of pest control as we know it today simply didn't exist for the common person. Here's a quirky tidbit about medieval pest deterrents. Some peasants would hang bundles of pungent herbs like tansy or wormwood near their sleeping areas or in their food storage, believing the strong smell would repel insects and rodents. while perhaps offering a mild deterrent to some pests, and certainly providing a change from the usual smoky stench, their effectiveness was limited against a determined rodent or a persistent flea colony. Imagine the overwhelming smell of dried herbs, a desperate attempt to drive out the unseen, scurrying and biting things that shared your dwelling. This leads us to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the constant presence of pests in medieval homes was merely an accepted fact of life, or if it contributed significantly to chronic low-level illness and reduced overall well-being beyond acute disease outbreaks. Did they truly just live with the fleas and rats? Or did these infestations actively make their lives harder and sicker on a daily basis? You flinch as something brushes against your leg in the dark, a constant, irritating reminder that you share your hard-won warmth with a multitude of unwelcome, hungry, and often disease-carrying companions. In your medieval winter, with the constant cold and the pervasive pests, one of the most challenging aspects of daily life was maintaining any semblance of hygiene habits. Forget your hot shower or even a quick scrub with soap and warm water. The cold reality of bathing and personal cleanliness was a stark reminder of your era's limitations. You catch a faint whiff of yourself, a mix of wood smoke, old wool, and unwashed skin, and sigh, knowing that a proper clean is a distant dream. Bathing, as we understand it, was a rare and arduous event for the medieval peasant. Especially in winter, heating enough water for a full body wash would require an immense amount of precious firewood, an expense most couldn't afford. Therefore, personal hygiene often consisted of quick, localized washes with cold water or melted snow at the well or from a shared bucket. Hands and face might be wiped, but full-body immersion was a luxury reserved for the very wealthy or for specific, often communal, bathhouses in larger towns, which were few and far between. You shiver just at the thought of splashing cold water on your exposed skin. Clothing, too, was rarely washed. Your coarse wool and linen garments would be worn for weeks or even months at a time, accumulating dirt, sweat, and smells. When they were finally washed, it was often a cold, laborious process, requiring vigorous beating and scrubbing in cold water, then drying them near the hearth, a slow and smoky affair. The change of clothes was minimal, perhaps 1 or 2 outfits per person, meaning that you were almost always wearing something that was far from fresh. You wear the same tunic day in and day out, feeling its rough texture and knowing it carries the accumulated scents of winter. Hair care was similarly rudimentary, washing hair was infrequent, and lice were a common problem, combated with fine-toothed combs and sometimes herbal concoctions. Dental hygiene was almost non-existent beyond perhaps chewing on certain herbs or rough foods to clean teeth. The focus was on survival, and cleanliness, while perhaps desired, was simply not a priority that could be afforded the necessary resources. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval hygiene standards were vastly different from modern ones, largely due to a lack of understanding of germ theory, limited access to clean water, and the sheer cost of fuel for heating water. This contributed significantly to the spread of disease and the general unpleasantness of daily life. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some medieval folk believed that too much bathing, particularly in hot water, could open the pores and make one more susceptible to disease, especially in winter. This folk belief, combined with the practical difficulties, provided a convenient justification for infrequent washing. Imagine being told that cleanliness might actually harm you in the cold, further cementing the practice of avoiding a good scrub. It's a bit of ancient health advice that suited the circumstances perfectly. This leads us to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the medieval lack of hygiene was primarily due to ignorance of its importance for health, or simply an unavoidable consequence of environmental and technological limitations. Did they not know that cleanliness prevented illness, or did they know but simply couldn't achieve it given their resources? You might feel a vague longing for the feeling of true cleanliness, a sensation you rarely experience, as the pervasive chill and the sheer effort of staying alive overshadow any desire for a refreshing bath. The scent of winter wasn't just in the air, it was on you and in you, as the relentless medieval winter tested your body and mind, the inevitable consequence of exposure, malnutrition, and poor hygiene often manifested as illness. This meant relying on rudimentary and often ineffective medical practices, treating winter ailments with a mix of folk remedies, herbal knowledge, and desperate prayers, often with little success. You feel the burning forehead of your sick child, and your heart sinks, knowing how limited your options are against the unseen forces of disease. For the medieval peasant, medical knowledge was a blend of inherited tradition, superstition, and limited practical experience. There were no doctors in your village, no accessible apothecaries with miracle cures. Instead, you relied on the wisdom of the village elder, the local wise woman, or perhaps a travelling leech, a term for a physician, not just the blood-sucking creature, if you were incredibly fortunate and could pay. Treatment for common winter ailments like coughs, fevers, and aches often involved herbal infusions, poultices, and sometimes more esoteric practices. You boil a pot of strong-smelling herbs, hoping their pungent steam will break a fever, feeling a mix of hope and despair. Common remedies for coughs and respiratory issues might include honey mixed with herbs, or inhaling the steam from boiling concoctions, as we discussed with the quirky tidbit in section 14. Fevers might be treated with cold compresses, or by inducing sweating with warm drinks and heavy blankets. For aches and pains exacerbated by the cold, various liniments made from animal fats and herbs might be rubbed onto the skin. The focus was often on addressing symptoms rather than understanding the underlying causes of disease. You administer a bitter herbal tea, hoping its warmth and purported properties will ease the incessant coughing that racks your family member. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval medicine was severely limited by a lack of scientific understanding of anatomy, physiology, and microbiology. The dominant theory was often the four humours, which posited that illness resulted from an imbalance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, leading to treatments like bloodletting or purging that were often harmful rather than helpful. Here's a quirky tidbit about medieval winter remedies. Some folk practices for chilblains, painful inflammation of skin caused by exposure to cold and damp, involved rubbing the affected areas with things like snow, onions, or even raw turnip slices. While applying cold could sometimes alleviate initial itching, the effectiveness of these highly unconventional treatments was questionable at best, and could even worsen the condition if not done carefully. Imagine grimacing as you rub a cold and raw onion onto your painfully inflamed toes, a desperate attempt at relief. This leads us to an open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the apparent resilience of medieval populations was due to their strong immune systems developed through constant exposure, or if the high mortality rates simply culled the weak, leaving only the naturally robust. Did they survive despite their medical practices? Or did their traditional knowledge provide more effective relief than we currently acknowledge? You watch and wait, knowing that the ultimate healer is often time, and that the biggest challenge is simply making it through the long, dark, and sickly winter months. The constant presence of illness, coupled with the futility of most cures, made winter a period of profound anxiety and powerlessness, just as you, the medieval peasant, were constantly battling the cold. So too were your working animals in the cold. They weren't just creatures to be kept fed, they were vital members of your household economy, providing muscle for ploughing, transport, and other essential tasks. Their survival through the winter was as critical as your own, and their care consumed a significant portion of your limited resources and labour. You pat the flank of your ox, feeling its rough hide beneath your hand, a silent acknowledgement of your shared struggle. Your oxen, horses, if you were lucky enough to own one, or had access to the lords, and even donkeys were indispensable for agriculture. In winter, while the fields were frozen, these animals still needed to be maintained. They required daily feeding with hay and whatever stored fodder you possessed, and constant access to water, often requiring you to break ice or carry heavy buckets. Their stalls or shelters needed to be mucked out, a freezing chore that was essential for their health and comfort. You carefully measure out their feed, knowing that a strong animal in spring means a successful harvest. Beyond basic sustenance, their physical well-being was a constant concern. Frozen ground could injure hooves, and icy paths made travel treacherous. Their coats, while providing some natural insulation, were no match for prolonged exposure to severe cold and damp. You might try to provide extra straw for bedding in their stalls, or even fashion crude covers from old sacks to offer a bit more warmth. The health of your animals was directly tied to your family's future, making their care a priority above almost all else. A mainstream historical fact is that draft animals, particularly oxen and later horses, were fundamental to medieval agriculture and transport. Their strength and endurance enabled farming on a scale impossible with human labor alone, making their health and survival through the winter a critical economic investment for any peasant family or village. Here's a quirky tidbit about working animals in winter. In some extremely cold periods, or for particularly valuable animals, owners might rub their legs and hooves with tallow or animal fat. This served a dual purpose. It could create a thin, protective layer against moisture and frostbite, and perhaps also offer a small, albeit temporary, warming sensation. Imagine the greasy task, your hands stiff with cold, as you apply rendered fat to your ox's legs, hoping to prevent painful cracking or freezing. It's a crude form of veterinary care, rooted in practical observation. This leads us to an open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants truly understood the optimal nutritional needs of their working animals in winter, or if the high rates of animal mortality and weakness in spring were simply an unavoidable consequence of resource scarcity. Did they provide the best possible diet given their limitations, or were their animals chronically underfed during the lean months, leading to reduced productivity when the spring thaw finally came? You watch your ox breathe deeply, its breath steaming in the frigid air, hoping its strength will hold until the spring ploughing, knowing that your very livelihood depends on it. The well-being of your animals was a direct reflection of your own tenuous hold on survival as you endure the final stretches of the medieval winter. A thought inevitably surfaces. How different is your struggle from the world outside? This brings us to a stark reflection, comparing eras. Specifically, your enduring struggle against the cold versus our modern comforts. You shiver, pulling your rough woolen blanket tighter, and try to imagine a world where warmth is not a battle but a given, a concept as alien as a dragon. You, the medieval peasant, live in a world defined by its raw, unfiltered elements. Your home is a mud hut, your warmth comes from a smoky fire, your clothes are crude wool, and your feet are perpetually cold. You battle against hypothermia, starvation, and disease with grit, ingenuity, and community spirit. But your life is a constant, physical confrontation with winter. Every day is a triumph over forces that could easily snuff out your existence. You're constantly aware of the biting air, the numb fingers, the aching joints, the fear of dwindling food. Now, briefly, consider our world. We flip a switch, and instant warmth floods a meticulously insulated home. We wear lightweight, technologically advanced materials that keep us warm and dry without bulk. We have abundant, varied food transported from across the globe, available at any time. Sickness is met with medicine, not just hope and herbs. The very concept of cold is often a minor inconvenience, not an existential threat. You might struggle to even comprehend such a reality, a world where the sun always seems to shine indoors and food never runs out. It's a luxury that would seem like pure magic to you. A mainstream historical fact is that the Industrial Revolution and subsequent technological advancements radically transformed human living conditions, particularly concerning housing, heating, and food production. The comforts we consider basic necessities today were unimaginable luxuries, or simply non-existent, for the vast majority of people throughout most of human history. Here's a quirky tidbit to really highlight the contrast. Imagine trying to explain a thermostat to a medieval peasant. The idea that a small box on the wall could magically sense the temperature and then command an unseen force to produce heat without a fire, without smoke, and without constant manual feeding of fuel would be utterly baffling, perhaps even seen as witchcraft. You might try to gesture, to explain the warm air, but the concept of such effortless control over the elements would be beyond comprehension. This leads us to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the perceived simplicity of medieval life inherently fostered a greater connection to nature and community, or if it was simply a brutal existence from which escape was constantly sought. Did the lack of comfort make them more resilient and appreciative of small joys? Or did it simply lead to a life of misery and suffering? You certainly feel the cold keenly. The hunger pangs a constant companion. But there's also a deep connection to the rhythms of the earth, a primal understanding of the struggle for survival that has been lost in our cushioned existence. Your reality, while harsh, is undeniably authentic, raw, and intimately tied to the natural world. As the last vestiges of winter begin to recede, leaving behind patches of lingering snow and a hint of damp earth, you find yourself contemplating the remarkable ability of your forebears, and indeed yourself, to simply endure. This brings us to the resilience of the past, a profound testament to the human spirit, its adaptability, and its sheer will to survive against truly overwhelming odds. You stand, perhaps at the threshold of your humble home, feeling the subtle shift in the air, a faint promise of warmth, and you realize the sheer grit that has carried you and your ancestors through countless brutal winters. Medieval peasant life was not just hard, it was a constant gauntlet of challenges. Every day was a fight against the elements, against hunger, against disease, against the demands of the Lord. Yet, generation after generation, they found ways to persist, to innovate with limited resources, to cooperate, and to maintain a sense of community and hope. Their adaptability wasn't about technology, it was about ingenious use of available materials, profound knowledge of their environment, and an unwavering communal spirit. You are a living embodiment of this resilience, forged in the crucible of countless cold nights. Consider the collective knowledge passed down, how to build a wattle and daub hut that, however leaky, offered shelter, how to preserve food without refrigeration, how to tend animals with minimal resources, how to find warmth in a world that offered so little. This wasn't learned from books, it was learned through observation, trial and error, and the bitter wisdom of experience. Every scratchy wool tunic, every smoked piece of meat, every communal gathering around the fire represented generations of accumulated wisdom in the art of survival. You draw a deep breath, feeling the faint, earthy scent of melting snow, and you know you've made it through another one. A mainstream historical fact is that humanity's ability to adapt to diverse and challenging environments is a hallmark of our species' success. The medieval period, particularly in regions experiencing the Little Ice Age, serves as a powerful case study in how entire societies developed complex, multifaceted survival strategies without the aid of modern technology or scientific understanding. Here's a quirky tidbit that speaks to this resilience. Some archaeological evidence suggests that during particularly long or severe winters, medieval peasants might even have resorted to consuming famine foods that were typically considered inedible or undesirable, such as bark, certain roots, or even boiled leather. While a sign of desperation, it also illustrates an extreme level of adaptability and a willingness to exploit every possible resource to extend life. Even when hope seemed lost, imagine boiling bark, trying to extract any last nutrient, a grim and final testament to the will to live. This leads us to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the resilience of medieval peasants was primarily a passive endurance born of necessity, or an active, conscious spirit of defiance against the harshness of their lives. Were they simply too powerless to do anything but suffer? Or did they possess an inherent strength and determination that allowed them to thrive against incredible odds? You might simply call it getting on with it, but in that simple phrase lies a profound testament to the unyielding power of the human spirit. The cold tried to break you, but you stood firm, year after year, waiting for the inevitable promise of spring. As the last of the ice melts from the edges of the well and the first timid green shoots begin to emerge from the still cold earth, you feel a profound easing of the tension that has held you captive for months. We conclude our journey through the medieval winter, leaving you with a lingering chill, but, hopefully, a deep appreciation for the sheer tenacity of those who came before us. This is the lingering chill, final thoughts on a medieval winter, a period that shaped lives, cultures, and our very understanding of resilience. The lessons from the medieval peasant's survival aren't just historical curiosities, they are a stark reminder of human vulnerability and ingenuity. They underscore the immense value of resources we now take for granted: abundant food, reliable heat, clean water, and accessible medicine. You can almost feel the aches in their bones, the hunger pangs, the constant struggle against the cold that permeated every aspect of their existence. It was a life lived on the very edge of survival, where a slight dip in temperature or a poor harvest could spell disaster. Yet, amidst that harshness, we glimpse moments of profound humanity, the shared warmth of families, the communal efforts to support one another, the solace found in stories and rituals. It was a world where human connection was not a luxury, but a fundamental tool for survival, where communities truly relied on each other to face down the overwhelming power of nature. You can picture them, huddled around their smoky fires, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames, their quiet determination shining through. As the sun gains strength and the days lengthen, the grip of winter slowly, reluctantly, loosens its hold. The sounds of birds return, the ground softens, and the promise of new life, of a fresh harvest, begins to whisper through the trees. The medieval peasant, having endured another brutal season, would emerge, often thinner, perhaps a bit weaker, but ready to embrace the arduous work of spring, forever marked by the long, cold nights that tested the limits of their endurance. And so, we leave the medieval peasant to their hard-won spring. You have journeyed with them through the biting winds, the gnawing hunger, the smoky interiors, and the constant threat of disease. You have felt the weight of their crude clothes and the ache in their perpetually cold feet. Their resilience, born of necessity, stands as a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit, the echoes of their struggle, the faint, acrid scent of their hearth fires, and the quiet dignity of their perseverance. Linger as you drift deeper into rest. Let the chill of their world slowly dissipate, replaced by the warmth and comfort of your own. Feel the soft blankets, the gentle hum of your fan, and the quiet stillness of your secure space. The distant past has receded, leaving you in the peaceful embrace of the present. End of script. Sweet dreams.